Welcome to the first webinar in the series Shaping Our Carbon-Free Future. I am Lori Barassi, GAIN's Program Manager. Unfortunately, Christine King had a family medical issue, so she will not be running the webinar today. Next slide, please. We have some logistics for you. We have speakers today, Zeke Housefather, Doreen Harris, Greg Cullen, Jordan Cox, and Zenab Dungarwala. Thank you very much for agreeing to present during this webinar. We look forward to hearing what you have to say. Your camera is turned off and your audio is muted. Please use the question feature on the GoToWebinar control panel to ask questions or to report technical difficulties at any time during this webinar. And as a special unique feature of this one, we're going to add some polling questions in the chat box. So watch that chat box as well, and you'll have a chance to engage and answer some questions during this webinar. So we'll see how that goes, and we're kind of excited for that new addition. The webinar is being recorded and it'll be available on the GAIN website very shortly, maybe tomorrow or at the end of this week. There'll be, along with that, then we will get started. Christine King had the vision for this webinar series several months ago, and as many of you know, she is very passionate about innovation and technology in our carbon-free future. The transformation of the entire energy sector from its current state to zero carbon by the second half of this century involves more than just changing the electricity sector. Nuclear is a major source of clean and reliable energy and an essential component of the clean energy future. However, nuclear is largely focused on baseload electricity generation with minimal interaction with other energy systems. To achieve the transformation, we must work together to consider all the potential pathways and innovations that can be used to meet our local, state, and national goals. Energy professionals are diving deep into this challenge to deploy today's carbon-free technologies and develop new ones. Given the need for reliable, clean energy in a growing market, the broader clean energy community will have to balance the various clean energy technologies to meet future energy needs with several options and pathways. Future nuclear energy options will include reactors of varying size and energy output, as well as those that can serve a variety of electric and non-electric applications, and those that can interplay with other energy generation technologies. The Carbon-Free webinar series for the next 6 months or so will include topics on energy transition, which is today's topic, on reimagining energy, which is the next one, and that will be another 2-part series. And then on innovations, one will be on policy innovation, technology innovation, financing innovation, and then stakeholder engagement. So we're looking forward to these webinars with some different speakers and some different perspectives, and we hope you enjoy them and will tune into all of them. They'll be on the GAIN website as they get planned and developed. So along with this webinar series, we've created a carbon-free glossary that's on the GAIN website. And if you have questions about some of the carbon-free lingo or terms, we've tried to make them simple and easy to understand. And certainly if you find terms that you would like defined or you have input to the way we've defined them, please send us a note and let us know. We'll be interested in your feedback. We've also launched a LinkedIn group called Carbon Free Innovators. And this group will continue addressing the challenges and opportunities for innovating and transforming the entire energy sector. So we hope you join that LinkedIn group. We'll get you that address in the chat. It's on the agenda. And with that, then, if you've got the agenda in front of you, we're here to examine the magnitude of the carbon-free challenge, the pitfalls of both near and far-term thinking, potential domino effects, terms, and how scenario planning is critical to the transition. We will go through the morning, this first session. We will have a panel discussion that Andy Worrell, our GAIN deputy, will moderate. And then you'll learn more about Andy on the second session. So the second session is more about the tools, and it should be very interesting. We're launching a new tool, and we're dying to show you what it can do. So please tune in to the second session of this webinar. But with that, let's go ahead and start with Zeke Hausfather from the Breakthrough Institute, and he will be talking about exploring the magnitude of the challenge. So Zeke, you are on.
Thank you, Lori. So I'm going to be talking a bit this morning at a very high level of the magnitude of the climate and energy challenge. Later on today, I'll be talking a bit more about, how to solve that, particularly in the US, and what various different visions of that are. But I wanted to start by just, talking through the challenge of climate change, the various pathways that would be required to meet Paris Agreement targets, and what track we're on today. And as a bit of background before I dive into that, so I'm a climate scientist by training, got my PhD from the University of California, Berkeley, but prior to that, I spent about a decade as an entrepreneur in the clean tech world. Served as the chief scientist and co-founder of Efficiency 2.0, chief scientist of C3 Energy, or .ai now, and currently I'm the director of climate and energy at the Breakthrough Institute. So if you go on to the next slide, please. So as I mentioned, I want to talk a bit about the magnitude of the challenge, where we're headed, and what's needed relative to where we are today to meet the Paris Agreement goals. So if you go on to the next slide. So when we talk about future climate change, we're really dealing with three separate sources of uncertainties. The first of these is the one that we can control, which is our emissions. And depending on how much CO2 and other greenhouse gases we emit, we could either end up in a world where our best estimate of warming is, well below 2 degrees, similar to the RCP 2.6 scenario, which is one of the 4 scenarios developed in the last IPCC report, or end up in a world, where our best estimate is 3 degrees warming or more, as in the RCP 6.0 and RCP 8.5 scenarios from the last IPCC report. But on top of what we can control, which is our emissions, there's also big uncertainties in the climate surrounding what we call climate sensitivity. So essentially how sensitive the climate is to our increases in greenhouse gases. And those bars in the second panel represent the uncertainty in temperature change at the end of the century due to climate sensitivity. And then on top of that, there's uncertainties in carbon cycle feedbacks. And carbon cycle feedbacks are essentially how the Earth's ability to absorb a portion of the carbon we emit in the oceans and the land is going to change as the Earth warms. And there are big uncertainties there as well. And what these uncertainties mean in aggregate is, even though we want to hope to pursue a policy where we limit warming to below 2 degrees, we can't rule out in the extreme warming of, say, 3 degrees or more if we roll sixes on all the climate dice on climate sensitivity and carbon cycle feedbacks. And so it's these, low probability, high impact extremes that really should drive our, caution around our future emissions, because we can't easily predict where we're going to end up just based on our emissions. So if you go on to the next slide. So in this talk, I'm going to focus on the one thing we can control, our emissions. I'm happy to chat with other folks at length about the other uncertainties. But if we just look at our emissions, there actually is some good news here. as I mentioned earlier, there's a number of different scenarios that have been created by the international community as part of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And for a while, a lot of people focused on what they called the business as usual scenario, where global emissions would triple by the end of the century. We'd have about 5 degrees or more of warming. This scenario is called RCP 8.5. And it's a scenario where the 21st century was dominated by coal globally. Global coal use increased by 600% above today's levels. And it really was the bulk of primary energy for the next century. Now, that world didn't seem impossible a decade ago when China was building a new coal plant every 2 days and global coal use was skyrocketing. But we're in a very different world today. Global coal use peaked back in 2013 and has been declining. And the idea that coal will be the dominant energy source of the 21st century seems very, very unlikely given falling prices of clean energy in particular. And so if we look at the latest International Energy Agency scenarios, the IEA current policies in red and the IEA stated policies in blue, they suggest a more moderate emission scenario, either modestly increasing or even plateauing relative to today's levels under current and stated policies respectively, which will likely lead to something more similar to RCP 4.5 or RCP 6, which is a world of around 3 degrees best estimate warming. But at the same time, there's a big gap between that and what would be needed to meet the Paris ambitious target of 1.5 degrees, or even the primary Paris goal of well below 2 degrees. So if you go on to the next slide. So as I mentioned, the biggest change we've seen in the global energy system in recent years is the move away from coal. This chart shows all of the previous IEA World Energy Outlook projections from 2013 through 2020, along with what actually happened in black. You can look at similar charts to this for the US with our Energy Information Agency, and you get very similar types of mismatches. But we all thought, or a lot of energy modelers thought, that coal would be, increasing through this decade and the next. And now it seems that, coal is actually going into structural decline globally under, current policies and technologies. And this has been a really big change. And if you go on to the next slide, one of the big drivers of this has been the fact that clean energy has become cheap. The difference in the prices of renewables in particular have really been stark over the last 2 decades. With the Biden administration coming in 2021, we're really in a different world in terms of technology than we were in 2009 when the Obama administration came in. And in many ways, this is being seen in the switch away from coal in the US, in a number of other, indicators of declining emissions in many of the richer countries, and of plateauing global emissions overall. And this is a good thing because in many ways, technology enables policy. The ability to take meaningful, strong action on climate change is a lot more plausible in a world with relatively low clean energy costs than a world with high clean energy costs. If you go on to the next slide. So what we argue is that current policies would result in about 3 degrees warming. This chart shows the different RCP scenarios from the last IPCC report with the range of warming across all of the climate models included in that report. So RCP 2.6, gets you to a best estimate of 1.7 degrees warming with a range of 1 to 2.5. RCP 4.5 is 2.6 degrees warming with a range of 1.8 to 3.3, all the way up to RCP 8.5, which is the best estimate of 4.6 with a range of 3.3 to 5.9. And if we plug in these recent IEA stated policy, which is STPS, and current policy, which is CPS, we end up with the best estimate of about 2.7 and 2.9 degrees respectively. So about 3 degrees warming being what the world is headed for now. Again, with a wide range due to uncertainties in climate sensitivity here. And carbon cycle feedback. So, we can't necessarily preclude warming of close to 4 degrees in a current policy world if we don't take, additional climate action beyond that, reflected in policy and technology prices today. If you go on to the next slide. And, we've seen similar estimates by other groups like Climate Action Tracker, for example. And what's really changed in the last year is not just the policies that are, codified in the Paris Agreement, which actually haven't changed that much, but rather these new net zero commitments that countries have started putting forward. The biggest of these, and in many ways the most unexpected, was the Chinese announcement this past year that they're going to try to reach net zero emissions by 2060. which is a really huge change from where everyone thought the trajectory of Chinese emissions would go, and would represent an enormous transition on their part, given that they're in a very different place in their development than, say, the US or Europe is, and therefore, have some bigger structural challenges in rapidly reducing emissions than we do. And so if you add in the new net zero commitment by China, the net zero commitments by South Korea and Japan, the net zero commitment by the Biden administration, the net zero commitment by the European Union, and various other countries around the world, you get to about 2.1 degrees warming. That's the optimistic target bar over there. So, it's still not well below 2 degrees in line with the Paris Agreement, but, we're getting within reach. We're bending the curve of emissions down with each of these new commitments in a way that, makes it seem like there is something here to be optimistic about, that, it's a heavy lift, but the idea of limiting warming to below 2 degrees is certainly not impossible from where we are today. At the same time, we should be a little cautious about spending too much time celebrating net zero commitments that are 30 to 40 years away, unless they're also reflected meaningfully in short-term policy. Obviously, everyone is paying attention right now to the next Chinese 5-year plan to see to the extent to which, this new aspirational 2060 goal gets reflected in near-term developments. But similarly, the extent to which the Biden administration is serious about net zero by 2050 is really going to be determined in part by what they can actually do from a policy perspective in the near term to be able to start driving US emissions down more rapidly. So if you go on to the next slide. So, as I mentioned, we're on track right now for a world of probably about 3 degrees warming by the end of the century under current policies and stated policies, the nationally determined contributions under the Paris Agreement, or NDCs, as they're shown in this graph. But there's still a very large gap between that world and what would be needed for either, limiting warming well below 2 degrees, or this chart also shows 1.8 degrees and 1.5 degrees respectively. This is a figure from the recent UN emissions gap report, which is a great report that comes out every year and sort of shows the gap between our current commitments and what's actually needed to meet the Paris Agreement targets. And that gap grows wider over time as we move forward with relatively flat emissions and not these dramatic emission reductions globally. To be honest, I'm personally pretty skeptical that the 1.5C scenario is even on the table anymore, given we're at about 1.3 degrees warming of pre-industrial today. But certainly, you could foresee getting to 2 degrees more plausibly. In fact, if you go to the next slide, if we zoom out a little bit and look at what is required to meet these different sort of climate targets, there is a bit of a question around how we define the climate targets, and it's a little bit ambiguous in the Paris Agreement. So the 1.5C target in particular has been, depending on what you're looking at, either defined as a 66% chance of avoiding 1.5 degrees C warming above pre-industrial. So taking into account these uncertainties in climate sensitivity in particular, or a 50% chance, sort of a best estimate of 1.5C by 1.5C by 2100. And that results in a somewhat different set of emissions trajectories, the green and the blue line respectively. Similarly, 2 degrees, you could look at either a 66% chance or 50% chance, which is the yellow and red line respectively. Now, all of these are simplified emission pathways in that they do not allow for large scale net negative emissions. So you're not sucking large, net negative amounts of carbon out of the atmosphere later on in the century. If you do that, you can have a bit more flexibility in the decline, particularly in the 1.5C scenarios. But the general point is that, if you really wanted to limit warming to 1.5 degrees, you'd have to cut all global emissions to zero in about 20 years, or you'd have to, have planetary scale engineering to suck enormous, mind-boggling amounts of carbon out of the atmosphere late in the century. So it's really hard to see from the standpoint of today, global action moving quickly enough to do that. At the same time, the 2 degree target is a world away from 1.5 degrees in terms of the plausibility of pathways, right? Even without large scale negative emissions, we'd have to get global emissions to net zero by 2070 to have a 66% chance of avoiding 2 degrees warming, which is a heavy lift, don't get me wrong, but it's not implausible at all from where we are today. We already have a lot of countries that have net zero targets for 2050 or 2060. And while the whole world might not follow along, there'll be enough positive spillovers from all these technological developments that it's certainly possible to foresee a 0 by 2070 scenario. And similarly, if we wanted a 50% chance of limiting warming to 2 degrees, we'd have to get to net zero globally by about 2085 or so. So while I'm skeptical of the 1.5C target, I think we still have many, many viable pathways to limit warming well below 2 degrees in line with the Paris Agreement. If you go to the next slide, it shows a similar view, but looking at those emission reduction pathways in light of our historical emissions globally since 1750. And so, we're talking about a decline, in the best case, about as steep as the incline that we've had over the last century. And in the worst case, we're talking about something 3 or 4 times faster decline than the increases we've had historically. So this is an unprecedented challenge for society in many ways, but one that we are starting to get the sorts of technologies at scale and at cost that we need to really make a dent in. And so if you go to the next slide, and the international community has done a lot of work using integrated assessment models to look at global technological choices that could drive decarbonization in a big way. And there's a huge amount of different integrated assessment models and different modeling teams all around the world, and they all have different assumptions about future technology prices that drive the relative mix of things like renewables and nuclear and CCS and other technologies. But what all of them agree on is the need for a dramatic expansion in the rate of deployment of all types of clean energy globally over the next few decades. So what this chart shows is the exajoules of electricity per year generated from clean energy in both a 2-degree scenario, which is on the left, and a 1.5-degree scenario on the right from YASA's message model. And again, don't pay too much attention to the specific energy mix of, say, nuclear versus wind versus solar, because that's going to depend a lot on the specific model and cost assumptions. But pay more attention to the overall curve. Our friend Leah Stokes actually coined a name for this curve. She called it the narwhal curve. She has a great video you can check out where she sort of illustrates it, because it kind of looks like a narwhal's tusk pointing out of the ocean. But it really is a huge ramp up between the rate of clean energy installation we've had historically over the last few decades and the rate of clean energy installation we would need globally to meet either of these targets, either 2C or 1.5C. We're talking about a huge scale up here. And if you go to the next slide, there's also, as I mentioned earlier, a lot of diversity across these different models in terms of what they foresee as drivers of the energy future. So this graph is looking at 6 different integrated assessment models, specifically the ones that were used in the new shared socioeconomic pathways, which is the energy modeling framework that's serving as the basis for the next generation of climate models being run in the upcoming IPCC 6th assessment report, which will be out later this year or early next, depending on how much it gets delayed. But the point of this graph is to show that under 2C scenarios, which is the right side, there's a huge diversity of energy mixes here. You have models like GCAM, which is the American Integrated Assessment Model, which actually has more nuclear than renewables globally in 2100. Or you have a model like REMIND, which I think is out of Germany, but I'm not actually sure, which has an enormous amount of renewables and almost no nuclear. And so it's hard to be prescriptive of particular technologies at this point in time, particularly if we're talking about a time horizon of 2100. But there's a wide range of possible solutions to this, and as we'll discuss at some length later on, there are some challenges with one mix versus another, and some argument for a balance here. Where the models are a little problematic, and we don't see this as much in some more modern models like the IEA Sustainable Development Scenario, for example, is that they tend to be very bullish on both carbon capture and storage. So coal with CCS is a big component of a lot of these models, as is gas with CCS, so that's in some ways less problematic. And they also tend to be really, really bullish on bioenergies, that big green chunk there. This is both biofuels for vehicles and bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, or BECCS, which is the preferred negative emissions technology of many of these models. And some of them, particularly if you start looking at the 1.5C models, but even some of the 2C models have some very aggressive assumptions around this. In some of the models, you have 3 times the land area of India, for example, devoted to bioenergy with carbon capture and storage by 2100. And so you're really talking about planetary scale engineering here. And so if you go on to the next slide. So there's a few takeaways from this very sort of high level look at global emissions and global energy system models. The first, and this is an important one, is that the very high warming scenarios, the sort of business as usual from a decade ago, that were based on high emissions pathways have become much less plausible, due in part to successes in making clean energy cheap. Cheap natural gas in the US also played a role in that, and there's other factors around technology, but cheap clean energy has been a big part of it. However, the world is still on track for around 3 degrees warming with current policies, and uncertainties in both climate sensitivity and carbon cycle feedbacks mean we still can't rule out 4 degrees plus. There's still this chance of low probability, high impact outcomes if we roll sixes on all the climate dice that we don't have control over. And that substantial additional emission reductions are required to limit warming to well below 2 degrees, and technology will not accomplish it alone. It's really hard to see any way that in the absence of strong policy, we could get to these very aggressive mitigation pathways. Maybe we could get the world down to 2.5 degrees warming if we have limited additional climate policy and a lot of optimistic assumptions around technology prices. But it's really hard to get much deeper reductions than that, at least in models. New net zero commitments are encouraging, but they really need to be supported by near-term policy. It's easy to have something on paper for 30 to 40 years from now, but the extent to which we should really treat it seriously is going to be determined by the extent to which it's incorporated and reflected in near-term policy priorities by countries. So with that, if you go to the last slide, thank you guys, and I'd be happy to have questions later on in the Q&A part of this.
Thank you, Zeke. That was very good. I have to say that I didn't know what a narwhal was until last year when my 4.5-year-old granddaughter told me. So
I think ever since the duck curve, we've all wanted to have. Ever since the duck curve, we've all wanted to have our own animal curves. So.
Yes, that was excellent. That's not one that's often mentioned. So thank you, and please do ask questions through the question feature, and we'll collect those so that we'll have a really good panel discussion later. So right now we'll move on to Doreen Harris. Doreen, if you'll turn your camera on, and we're so happy to have you here to present. Thank you very much. You can go ahead.
Great. You hear me okay, Lori?
Yes.
Okay, thank you, and good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to follow Zeke. I'm one of his biggest fans from an analytic perspective, and someday maybe get to join a podcast or something with you and Leah. That would be awesome. But in the meantime, I'm certainly here to put this topic in a New York perspective. Clearly, what we've just heard from Zeke is very relevant globally, and really what it comes down to is, of course, actions that will be taken across the globe, and specifically here in New York, to achieve goals like those that we're describing. So I lead the New York State Energy Research and Development Authority. We are the state's energy office, but also the clean energy agency responsible for implementing many programs on behalf of Governor Cuomo in achievement of our Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act. So I have led the organization since last summer, and have worked for the state about 11 years prior. So if you go to the next slide, I'll certainly put this in the context of our Climate Act as we speak today. Next slide, please. So indeed, we certainly in the state of New York believe and agree with respect to the existential threat that climate change does present, certainly, and our state has been taking very significant actions to address just that threat through the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, which was signed into law in 2019, which specifically places New York State on a path to carbon neutrality across all sectors of our economy. So the headline numbers are here for your perusal. Most notably, there are not only requirements for the long term, that is 2050 is really a significant year with respect to our goals, but also interim goals for 2030 and 40 around first 70% renewables from an electricity sector and 100% zero emissions by 2040. So what is notable for us as a state in implementing the Climate Act, though, beyond the goals that you see here, is the fact that our act, and many, even on a federal perspective, looks very carefully at the balance of issues with respect to not only the achievement of these important climate goals, but the assurity that the investments associated with those goals will benefit very importantly, in our case, disadvantaged communities across New York State, such that at least 35% with a goal of 40% of those benefits will go to disadvantaged communities. So that is an important hallmark of these policies for sure. In our case, just to give you some sense of where we sit as a state, our most recent data is a little bit old, but in 2019, just to give you an idea, New York's load was just over 153,000 gigawatt hours, and the contribution from renewable resources was 27% at that time, made up primarily of hydroelectric resources with increasing amounts of wind, solar, and other smaller contributors. Relevant to today's discussion, the contribution in New York to our load from nuclear generation is about 32% for that same year. So just to give you some idea as to where we sit, we certainly have an aggressive goal, but we have some really substantial developments that have helped us realize its achievement. So if we turn to the next slide, you know, very practically speaking, many states need to determine how to get from here to there. And in New York, we have the establishment of a 22-member Climate Action Council that is supported by a number of New York State agencies, as well as other sector-specific experts, including appointments by the governor, the Senate, and the Assembly, majority and minority leadership. I co-chair the Climate Action Council with Commissioner Basil Sagos of the Department of Environmental Conservation. And much like you just heard from Zeke, we have the responsibility to develop a scoping plan to get us from here to there with the information provided by 7 sector-specific advisory panels and a Just Transition Working Group and a Climate Justice Working Group. And in a sense, what these advisory panels are tasked to do is to identify a range of emissions reduction actions that will help us to reach the broader goals, but on a sector-specific basis. Ultimately, our job as a Climate Action Council will be to integrate those recommendations analytically to determine a number of scenarios that could be evaluated to help New York achieve its objectives through the Climate Act. So the work is underway. It is significant, but it is also inspiring as we are seeing this come into place very actively with almost 70 advisory panels meetings since March of last year. And at the moment, I think it's 80 different strategies being considered by these panels to fine-tune the recommendations for the scoping plan. We as a state have all of these meetings open to the public and certainly provide opportunities for public comment and feedback throughout. But as the Climate Action Council advances its work, there's a number of developments across the state that I wanted to touch on briefly. Next slide, please. So in this year's State of the State address, it is very obvious and very real for us that these investments are not only benefiting us from a climate change perspective, but also an economic development perspective. And this year's State of the State address included some significant announcements really looking at implementing these programs, specifically from the perspective of the renewable energy sector, but also far beyond. So you can see within this State of the State address, we are making massive investments in clean energy. In fact, New York is the largest purchaser of renewables by far at this point. In fact, the amount of renewables we have under contract right now as a state when they begin operating will bring us from that 27% I had referenced all the way above 50% of renewables serving our load when they enter operation. But we are also investing in related technologies like energy storage, clearly a necessary facilitator of the grid flexibility that we need. And in addition, the workforce development needs that are required to bring these investments and the jobs locally to support these projects. In addition, we have massive investments in solar, and notably in disadvantaged communities related to solar that I'll be touching on in just a minute as well. Next slide, please. So this is the headlines coming up from earlier this year, where we in New York had made the largest combined renewable energy awards in the nation. You know, the renewable energy sector is a critical, obviously, component of this, particularly when we look at the amount of electrification that is largely needed to decarbonize buildings, transportation, and the like. So of course, it is a necessary precursor to achieve the goals we seek. And when we look at the game-changing technologies we in New York are pursuing, I think offshore wind would have to be top of the list. New York has a 9,000 megawatt goal for offshore wind, the largest in the nation. But relatedly, just to give you some idea of scale, that goal alone will serve about a third of New York's load in 2035. So we focus on the resources that can bring us scale, durability, and investments. And offshore wind checks all of those boxes. And we are in the process of negotiating the largest procurement of renewable energy ever. Again, 2,500 megawatts of capacity, renewable capacity as part of those awards. If we go to the next slide, though, it's important to note that it's not just about generation. One thing that we are spending a tremendous amount of time on is transportation. We have invested $1 billion to electrify our transportation sector, and it's through a range of initiatives. It's about charging, it's about technology, it's about electric vehicles, and it's about the adoption of all of these technologies. And certainly, as part of the Climate Action Council process, the roadmap for cleaning our transportation sector is going to be a significant piece of that effort. We are making very similar investments in the building sector, which wasn't really a focus of today's presentation, but what is obvious to us is it's going to take all of these investments to get to our goals and, again, to the necessary outcomes that were just described. Next slide, please. As I conclude, I wanted to note that innovation is really also a necessary precursor to achieving any of these goals. And that's one amazing thing about the organization that I lead, that we are not just implementing and administering, we are innovating. And we at NYSERDA are fostering market transformation in a way that is a truly phenomenal undertaking, both delivering value to customers, but also bringing forth technologies that can help to decarbonize these sectors that are most challenging for us to realize, both in New York and broadly. So since 2009, we have invested and leveraged more than $1 billion in private capital and $349 million in non-NYSERDA grants, just to give you an idea of scale. And in fact, as a state, we have commercialized more than 440 new and improved clean energy products, again, as a necessary precursor in technology investments and business development support. Next slide, please. So this was a very quick walk through a very complex undertaking, but really what I want to conclude with is it takes all of these factors. It takes decarbonization of all of these sectors, and hopefully giving you a touch of the reality that we are seeing in New York as to how to get to the goals of the Climate Act and also to benefit, of course, the broader ecosystem at the same time. So thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you, Doreen. It's very interesting that you've commercialized 440 new products. That is something that we should talk a little more on the panel, maybe. And maybe there's something in the future for a discussion. That's a different take on what we've been hearing. So very interesting. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, the next up is Greg Cullen. All right, Greg. Thank you again for presenting, and you have the mic.
All right, thank you, Lori. Appreciate the opportunity to be here today and speak to you. I'm Greg Cullen. I'm the Vice President of Energy Services and Development for Energy Northwest. I've been with Energy Northwest for a little over 27 years and spent a good portion of that at Columbia Generating Station, the nuclear energy facility, and spent the last few years over here on the other side of our company developing new clean energy solutions. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. Next slide. I'll, kind of following up on what Zeke and Doreen have talked about, I'll talk a little bit about where we are in Washington State and the Pacific Northwest and what we're seeing as far as our future and how we're going to reach our goals. Next slide. Let me start off talking just a little bit about Energy Northwest and who we are. Energy Northwest is not a retail or wholesale utility. We are a joint operating agency. We have 27 public power member utilities that we provide generation and services for. Next slide. We provide, right now we operate hydro, wind, solar and storage, as well as I mentioned, Columbia Generating Station, the Northwest's only nuclear energy facility. In addition to providing clean energy services for our members, such as demand side management and electric vehicle charging infrastructure build out. Next slide. So this is a summary of the Washington Clean Energy Transformation Act that was passed last year. It eliminates all coal, either in the state or imported into the state by 2025. Sets an expectation of 100% carbon neutral for all electricity generation by 2030. And that's defined as really needing for 80% of all power coming from clean energy sources, with the other 20% being able to be satisfied by renewable energy credits or credits for energy transformation projects, or quite simply paying a carbon penalty type, if you will, on that last 20%, anything that's not clean, with the final goal of 100% clean by 2045. But what is powerful about the Washington State Act is that that definition of clean energy does include both renewables and non-emitting electric generation, which does include nuclear, carbon capture and sequestration, anything that basically is non-carbon emitting. Next slide. But at the same time that we have this clean energy legislation and this drive for clean energy coming to the state, we are seeing, and partly related to this and partly not, next slide, if you don't mind, a concern in the region about where we're heading in terms of capacity. Capacity really talks to that ability to meet your peak loads. It's kind of like the things we've seen in California and Texas over the last year. Do I have what I need to meet those peak loads? And in many cases, we're not even talking about extreme peak loads like we've seen there. And this is a kind of a compilation of several projections done by reputable agencies in the region, making projections on where we will be in capacity. And you can see that every single one of them says that into this year, we're already seeing a deficit in capacity. And we expect that to worsen as we see load growth as well as reduction, particularly in coal plants over this period. Next slide. This is something that the region has done a lot to try to study and understand because of the level of concerns that we've had. In 2019, we were very close to having our own sort of California or Texas event where we almost had to have rolling blackouts in a cold winter spell. One study that's been done that was even issued before that event is performed by Energy and Environmental Economics, or E3 as we like to call them. Next slide, please. And this study kind of looked at what it takes to meet the capacity needs. So, one of the things that you have to look at when you're talking about capacity is, we talk a lot about capacity factor. How much energy do I get out of a particular resource compared to its nameplate if I got the nameplate for the full year? But the reality is that a lot of that energy still comes out during the times when I don't need it as much, right? Maybe spring or fall is when I'm getting most of that generation that's determined in the capacity factor. So when you're talking about the ability to meet actual capacity, my peak loads, which for us and most places come in the winter and summer, I have to decide how much can I assign, how much do I expect from a particular resource in terms of percentage of its nameplate. And so what we found in our region for the Pacific Northwest has a particular challenge in that the more we are to need a generation, the less likely we are to have wind and solar based on the way our weather systems work. And so that really creates a challenge for relying on those resources. And so you can see here that what they used in the models was basically that wind, I can only count on about 7% of wind to be there when I need it, and only about 12% of solar. Next slide, please. And what this then results in is, as I start applying carbon constraint scenarios to the grid, and I'm able to use less and less gas to meet my needs, then I'm having to significantly overbuild the renewables and energy storage in order to be able to be comfortable I'll have the capacity when I need it. And so this slide kind of shows you the stack of resources that I need from a nameplate standpoint significantly grows, and with it the expense of that as I move to the right in the higher carbon constrained scenarios. And so one of the things this really highlights is that we talk a lot about the cost of different resources, but the cost of a renewable resource is really not shouldn't be compared directly to the cost of a firm resource that I can rely on to be there when I need it. And so really, as you see here, I have to think about from a capacity standpoint the significant overbuild in those, and therefore the cost of that overbuild compared to a firm resource. Next slide. Well, after CETA was passed, we commissioned our own study to kind of look at what's the right mix for the region to meet those goals, and also to make sure that the study looked a little bit broader in terms of all the resources it had available. Next slide, please. And as we worked through this, we found similar results. The footprint of our study was slightly smaller than the other one, but we found similar results. You'll see here again the amount of resources that would have to be added, in this case looking at 2045 when CETA required clean energy. The amount of resources that would have to be added if I relied on just renewables and storage to meet those goals was significantly more than just the expected load growth. Next slide. And then what we found is as we allowed the models to add additional options, including extending Columbia Generating Station's license another 20 years, and adding several other firm clean technologies such as carbon capture and sequestration, or small modular reactors. And in this third column, it used NREL published pricing and estimates for small modular reactors, and in the fourth column, we used NuScale estimates because of how well developed their cost estimates are. And what you can see is as we allow the model to choose those other firm resources, it really starts choosing quickly a lot of new nuclear because of its attributes of being clean, being firm, being reliable, and even being flexible to pair with renewables and storage. And so you can see in the far right here in this scenario that by adding in, allowing the models to choose new nuclear and to relicense Columbia Generating Station another 20 years, this scenario actually saves over $8 billion per year for the region compared to trying to meet all those needs with just renewables and energy storage alone. Next slide. And so what we've really determined is, and for our region, for our state to be successful in meeting CETA, for our region to be successful in meeting carbon goals, the right mix for us going forward is wind and solar with battery storage or other forms of storage, our hydro, which is plentiful in this region, existing nuclear, maintaining Columbia Generating Station out into and beyond 2045, and finally new nuclear, that we see that has to be a part of our least cost solution going forward. Next slide. And so as many of you may know, Energy Northwest has actually been named key energy or key utility partner with both of the Advanced Reactor Demonstration Program awards that were announced in October of last year. Those right now there's a high likelihood that, well, they're both planned to be sited in the Northwest, with a high likelihood that both could be sited within Washington State. And again, it goes back to the studies, what we've seen, and our clean energy goals here. These projects, if you're not aware, provide 50% cost share from the federal government to get these projects up and running this decade. This kind of shows you some of the other, the four main prongs of what's the federal government's approach at building new reactors this decade, including the UAM's carbon-free power project, which will also be a Northwest project. So again, just, we see that right now, based on the carbon targets and requirements that we've set for the region, based on our challenges of how well renewables can or cannot meet our capacity needs, that nuclear has to be part of our future and is part of the right mix, and has led to us, again, being part of this ARDP projects that we're very excited about, and seeing a high possibility and probability of nuclear being part of our solutions to go forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Greg. That was very good. And it is very interesting about how much of this has changed in the last 5 years or so. It's pretty amazing. It seems like it was going at a slow pace, but when you think about it, there's been a lot going on in 5 years in this area. So we appreciate that. If the panelists will turn on their cameras, Zeke and Doreen, we're going to turn it over to Andy Worrell. There's been a lot of interesting questions come through. Andy is our GAIN Deputy Director, and he's from Oak Ridge National Lab, and he'll tell you a little more about himself, but he will take over from here. So thank you again very much.
Thanks, Laurie. Yeah, so welcome everybody to the panel Q&A, and thanks for some really interesting presentations from a kind of overall world perspective down to the implementation at the state level. I found the whole thing kind of fascinating, because I think we all too often focus on the big picture and don't get down into the implementation. So I thought to hear that was fantastic. So I'm Andy Worrell. I'm the Deputy Director of GAIN. I'm also, I work at Oak Ridge National Lab, as Laurie just mentioned, where I'm a section head on the integrated fuel cycle. As you can tell by my accent, I'm from East Tennessee originally, not from Oak Ridge. So I spent about almost 20 years working for the UK nuclear industry for British Nuclear Fuels Limited on everything from fuel production to reprocessing technology and so on. And I've also been involved in the UK National Laboratory and advising UK government on energy policy and on plutonium management. So all these fields kind of touch on many of my 27 years now experience. So great to hear some of these. So great comments and observations. So let's get into the questions, because I'm fascinated. We've had some really interesting questions. Let me start with just one or two kind of like big questions to you all, and please feel free to chip in as we go. The first question, or first series actually we had, is are we doing enough? Is the world doing enough right now? And I guess the follow-on question I would have with, are we doing enough? If we're not doing enough, then what else do we need to do? So Zeke, you started with that kind of bit. Let's start with Zeke. I'll throw that to you first, Zeke, because I think you had the big world picture question there.
Sure. So, the simple answer is no, we're not doing enough today. Current policies put us on track for around 3 degrees centigrade warming above pre-industrial by the end of the century. And that would be, pretty devastating for a lot of natural and some human systems. And so, we need to significantly increase our efforts. And, we also need to both do more in the US and think globally around these things. There was a good quote from Bill Gates around his new book recently, where he argued that in some ways making clean energy cheap is just as important as actually deploying it. And his reasoning there is that, while building more wind and solar and nuclear in the US is really important to meet our goals, if we want the Indias of the world, the Indonesias of the world, the Brazils of the world to be building these technologies at a big scale as well, we need to make it a cost-effective alternative to fossil fuel-driven development for them. And so, thankfully, there's a virtuous cycle here, right? We learn by doing. The more we build, wind, solar, small modular reactors, any of these more nascent technologies here in the US, the cheaper they get, the more we learn how to build them effectively, and the more we can sort of help build them around the rest of the world.
No, thanks. Yeah, that's really good observation. Yeah, obviously Bill Gates has got some great observations about these things, and he's a very influential voice. So it's good to have that from both Dorian and Greg. I mean, obviously at the local level are doing a tremendous amount. It was great here, but in terms of what you're doing, do you feel your hands are tied in some way? And I was interested to ask whether that was down to policy, was it down to technology, was it down to cash, was it down to the public acceptance? What are some of the kind of hurdles you've got, the way you feel you need to do more or would like to do more? Doreen, I'll ask you that first.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, in a practical sense, well, certainly Zeke's points are well taken as to, sort of how we get from here to there, and is the slope of the line sufficiently steep, right, to achieve the objectives. I think that question he answered very well. From our perspective, I think the key really is one of not only public acceptance, but public support. A state like New York, although, a leader with respect to our goals, can only achieve our goals, or can do so much more effectively, if we are joined by what will need to be a global movement. Because indeed, the cost reductions that we seek, the changes of the magnitude that we need to employ, are better achieved when we aren't going it alone, and ultimately everyone is doing it at a scale similarly situated. And that is all driven by public interest, public support, and ultimately belief in the principles that we all seek to achieve. And so we're very encouraged every time there's a public poll, as to really acknowledgement of the issues, embracing of the issues, whether, whatever side of the aisle you may sit on. That's encouraging. But now sort of putting it into practice is a whole different ball game altogether, because this requires a change in people's lives. It requires a change in their way of living that ultimately is going to be successful only if those benefits are internalized. And that's the issue. It's implementing and executing, as is always the case. But that is much easier when there is a public movement in that direction.
Greg, do you have anything from your perspective, from your local experiences?
Yeah, I think, one of the things that we talk a lot about that maybe has been a challenge for us over the last, decade maybe, is whether or not people really believe this is a crisis that has to be addressed, whether or not we, are looking at it from a scientific standpoint, or whether it's just a political issue. I feel like we've turned the corner on that a bit. But now when we start talking solutions, I feel like we're facing the same crisis, right? I think too many of the opinions about what the right solution or solutions aren't, are fought in headlines and policy and politics. And, again, I think when we start looking at the science, we have to realize that this is an all technology approach. We have to be pursuing all clean technologies in order to be successful here. And if we try to pick, a certain one and say we can do it by this alone, I think we're going to hurt ourselves, and we're not going to be successful. And what we're seeing in our region is, again, the utilities are on the front lines. The utilities that are our members, the utilities that we meet with around the region, they have the tools to analyze this, and it's their basic business to analyze what's the right approach and what's the least cost approach. But they have to face those reliability challenges. And what they're telling us in clear language is we can't do this with renewables and batteries alone, even though that's what the headlines like to say. When you look at the models, when you look at the analysis, we need something more firm, and we need a much broader approach. So I just think it's time for us now as a country to face, in a world, to face the science side of the solution set, now that we've sort of moved a little past agreeing on the problem.
No, thanks for that. You've all touched on a few different things, and just give you a quick perspective just to kind of spark the conversation again. About in the early 2000s, when UK government decided to have its energy policy, and that's the first thing that's often different that people may not always be aware of. And there's the federal intervention and the federal policy, and then there's obviously the state implementation and state actors. And it's great to have both Dorian and Greg to kind of give that perspective. The UK perspective, what the game changer was the fact that they had bipartisan agreement that the UK needed an energy policy, and they set what that policy must have as its metrics. What the implementation of it was down to interpretation, and that would be more down to the markets to decide. But it needed an energy policy to start that, and bipartisan political agreement on that in the first place. The other thing as well, which was really interesting, and this is kind of teeing up the next question, is the one thing that probably changed the UK public's perception of, and again, this isn't just nuclear, this is just the whole energy portfolio, is energy security. And energy security in the UK and Europe means something different, I think, that it probably does in the US. Energy security to the UK meant, bless President Putin, he turned off the gas pipeline to the Ukraine, and at the end of the Ukraine pipeline, further west, was the UK. And the UK only had 3 days of natural gas reserves available to it. 3 days seems like a reasonable thing for just-in-time planning from the utility guys. I'm sure you're aware, you don't want to be storing weeks and months and years of gas. 3 days seem reasonable until you run out. And suddenly that was the deciding factor, that energy security as well as economics and climate was really important to the UK. So I think what's really interesting then is then the public feel it in their real world, and the public felt it in their back pocket, so to say, because their utility bills started going up because of the necessity to import. So the question I kind of, just in terms of, again, for all of you, but again, perhaps both for Dorian and Greg to start this, is, based on the issues that happened in Texas, recent events in Texas, has that kind of like sharpened your thinking, or made people think differently in your solutions to what you were proposing? Because that's resilience rather than energy security, really. So it's a different, I think, Greg, you touched on that with like the batteries and the renewables. So what's your thoughts on that? Has anything changed in your thinking?
I think it's a great example too of what I was talking about. There's headlines all over the place, right? And people throwing stones and pointing fingers. And so I spent the time digging through the details myself on the data about, what happened there and what you see. And the wind generation dropped almost to nothing at times, and dropped way off of what they had even 2 weeks earlier, less, about a quarter or less on average. Natural gas, while they had a lot that didn't operate, there was carried the bulk of the grid. I mean, there was a ton of natural gas on the system, and it just highlights the challenges of what we're talking about. If we just keep our head in the sand, if you will, I think, again, I told you we almost had an event like that a couple years ago. California had their event. Texas and even into the Midwest had their events this year. I think, the system is trying to send us a signal that we do need to have an urgency, and we have to understand that we have to be ready for all eventualities. Like you said, someone turning off the gas supply line, whether that's Putin or the cold weather. We have to be ready for those things, and we have to build a system that's able to withstand what are likely to be more frequent severe events like this because of the climate impact.
Yeah, Dorian, do you have anything, your thoughts from the New York perspective?
Yeah, I actually had touched on this topic during our Climate Action Council meeting last week. In doing so, I had consulted rather extensively with the New York Independent System Operator, as well as the chair of the Public Service Commission, because these issues are all integrated. Long story short, obviously New York is a lot different than Texas in a lot of regards. So I think there are some notable differences, but to previous points, important learning certainly that we can apply, and of course this will evolve as further investigations occur. But I do think the single biggest learning of the Texas experience is that future weather events will challenge what we believe to be within the realm of likelihood. So indeed, although New York's planning and forecasting models have proven to be robust, and certainly have done so, we do need to really think about planning and forecasting in this context. And we also need to come to terms with what it will cost to build in resiliency. Even if it's a low probability event, these are high impact events. So really what that means collectively is another area that we are certainly considering. I think it is also true, back to the principles of the CLCPA here in New York, it is true that there were disproportionate impacts on low income and non-white communities that is fundamentally relevant to our goals and their achievement, but also the fact that even in Texas, environmental justice communities bore the brunt of repeated emissions events as well during the event. So yes, we will closely scrutinize that experience. As always, we can always learn how our grid can become more flexible and resilient, and also to advance innovation and technology and systems management to help us along the way as well. Because these reliable zero emissions grids that we are seeking are certainly fundamentally different than what they are today.
Yeah, and I think the interesting one there is that I think it's an old saying, but don't put all your eggs in one basket, right? And I think that's where we all too often, and again, nuclear is as guilty as anybody else, where nuclear has said the answer is nuclear, that's all dash nuclear, and then the renewables are all saying the answer is renewables, that's all dash nuclear. And the answer is, and this is back to the kind of my observations from the UK, was the UK government and policy stakers never pitched nuclear versus renewables. The answer is nuclear and renewables. Because if you want to truly make the biggest impact in terms of climate and energy security and all these other things, those things can work together in a synergistic way, but also in a backup kind of way, and really work together in a kind of symbiotically. So I think there's a lot to be said for that. So again, part of this discussion and this GAIN series for everybody kind of listening in is that what we're trying to do is bring those communities more together to have these kind of discussions to understand where we can all actually work together. We all actually have common objectives and common interests. So yeah, please, Zeke.
Could add on the Texas side, you know, I think a lot of the issue there was not just not planning effectively for the future, but not even planning for the past. You know, Texas had events similar to this in 1989, a bit of a weaker one in 2011. The recommendations from both of those were to make the grid more resilient. And so we really saw failure across, you know, all the different generating technologies. But I think it does raise an important point when we're talking about high renewable grids. And Texas is getting to, I think, about 20% wind right now, which is that currently they are relying pretty extensively on thermal generation as a backup and to deal with your issues of intermittency. And the more renewables you have in a grid, the more sort of you're relying on these firm dispatchable thermal resources, and the more you're vulnerable to a disruption in those resources. We saw some similar examples with the brief blackouts California had this past summer. And so it's one of the big challenges when you're trying to integrate large amounts of variable renewables is you need a more modern grid than we have today. You need one that is able to get extra power when it needs it and send it where it needs it. And doing that in a way that doesn't make the system vulnerable to disruptions is critically important, because there is a real risk that we pursue these sort of solutions, we don't take this concern into account enough, we have, you know, big disruptions, and, you know, it causes people to turn against certain energy sources in a way that's counterproductive to larger decarbonization goals.
Yeah, no, that's a great observation. Actually, that's a nice segue into another series of kind of questions that came in, and that's that obviously, you know, if there's a high reliance on renewables, then you need an alternative, a backup. So therefore you need a grid that can respond. So there's a significant investment for that grid and grid modernization. But then equally you need electricity production system, form, whatever it may be, that can be switched on and switched off, or having spinning capacity that you can switch it over when you need to. And that's where that kind of renewables and nuclear or whatever else may be interesting. So one of the questions that's come in, and I guess Dorian, you probably expected this kind of question to come in from a nuclear crowd, and that is the fact that New York is moving to, I think you said 9 gigawatts of new offshore wind and so on and so forth, yet at the same time the nuclear power stations are closing in your region. Is there any comment, observation as to what the logic is or the impact of that kind of decision?
Sure. Yes. Glad to talk this through. And folks should look at my background. I started my career in the nuclear power generation industry, so glad to certainly talk about these points. You know, clearly when we look forward, yeah, and it is true. We are at a juxtaposition in New York, where specifically we are actually closing Unit 3 of Indian Point just next month, and of course, we have other generators who similarly have, you know, expiration dates for their renewals coming up. In the coming, in the coming couple of decades, certainly among those areas that we have as a juxtaposition of issues. But when we look forward, and I think to Greg's point, I think E3 is the big winner here. Everybody is using E3 to look at a reasonable future for our grid. We started our work with a pathways analysis, much like the one that was just described, in that we are looking at really how we will fundamentally, reliably meet growing electricity loads with a 100% zero emissions electricity grid. And ultimately, to your point, it is absolutely true. We need to do so by relying on a diverse set of resources, which would include the wind and solar that we talk about, but also preserving and increasing the amount of hydroelectric power serving our grid, both within our state and imported from other markets, as well as a necessary precursor. But the initial pathways work, the base case did presume the retention of our existing nuclear capacity. And then again, to the extent balancing resources are needed, that new combined cycle zero emission biogas facilities and or gas fired combined cycles with CCS included would be needed for that balancing resource. So currently we're taking a technology neutral approach fundamentally to advance our decarbonization goals in New York. But clearly there is a balance of issues. We talked about stakeholder issues also relatedly that are all going to come into play in the ultimate scenarios that drive our scoping plan here in New York. There are many interested stakeholders on both sides of this question, but ultimately our approach is really looking at, again, the resources that would help us hit these goals with a reliable grid and the diversity that it brings.
No, thanks for that. I'm conscious we're going to get close to, because we've done so well. So first of all, I should have thanked all of the speakers for sticking exactly. So if only with nuclear folks could stick to building reactors on target and on cost like you guys have just done in your talk. So in the last few minutes, one thing I just like to touch on, and again, it's a theme that's come out in a couple of the questions, and is how do we convince the public? But here I would like to open that up more a little bit further, and that's the politicians, the investors. It's the broader stakeholders. What more can we do as a community to really convince this broad set of stakeholders that this is real, this is a near and present danger, that we all have a contribution to make? What can we do? What should we be doing, either individually or collectively? I'd love to hear your thoughts as to how we can get this this agenda moving forward. Let's start with Zeke. I think Zeke, you've got some kind of big world picture on that.
Yeah, I mean, it's a tough question. I wish I had a great answer for it. I think the important part is to, talk about the science, but also try to talk about the science in a way that's not political. I think one of the big challenges in the US compared to the UK, where I've done some work with a group called Carbon Brief there for many years, is in the UK, climate is, at least the science of climate change is not fundamentally a political question, right? There's widespread agreement in both the conservatives and the liberals, and labor, I should say, that climate change is real and is a problem and needs to be dealt with. There's certainly disagreements around what the optimal solution is, but that's a good place to be in. I feel like one of the big challenges in the US right now is that climate has become an ideological wedge issue. And I think the more we can move it away from that and say, you might not like wind, you might not like solar, you might not like nuclear, but let's discuss the solutions to this, and let's find where we can find some agreement around solutions. We can paint an optimistic picture of what a future could look like that has cheap, clean energy, that has good jobs for people, and move away from these sort of ideological battles about the nature of climate change. I think is better for all of us. It's just a challenging thing to do.
Yeah, no, thanks, Zeke. Greg, what from your, I guess even maybe from a local perspective, what kind of things has your organisation and area been doing to kind of get their message out there to the people?
Yeah, I think it's really about the education. I mean, it's just like anything, right? Talking about things like our study and other supporting studies that have concluded the same things. What we're actually seeing, I think, if you look at it in DC right now, I mean, the ARDP program that I talked about, bipartisan, bicameral funding of $8 billion, up to $8 billion over this decade for those projects. I think Biden has made it clear that he sees nuclear has to be part of the mix, and it's an all technology approach from his perspective. Within our state, we're seeing kind of the same thing. Our governor ran for president, made climate his main platform, and talked about the fact that nuclear has to be a part of that mix. And I think we're seeing broadened support within the state legislature. So I think we're seeing it with those that really have to face what it takes to solve this problem. I think we're seeing that the science, the information wins out. So I think it's just a matter of continuing to educate and get that out there. But I do think the public's a harder position, and unfortunately Zeke's right. Now that it's been politicized, it's going to be harder. But I do feel like we're turning the corner on the climate being a problem, and so I'm hopeful we can use similar approaches to turn the corner on what the solution set looks like.
No, thanks, Greg. That's great. Doreen, you himself, any additional comments and thoughts from your experience?
Yeah, sure. As I said, while we are taking a technology neutral approach, there are certainly difficulties from a stakeholder perspective in doing so. There are many stakeholders who see, technology specific outcomes as the only possible outcome. So I would say there is a perception issue with respect to nuclear generation as being, I'll call it a first generation technology, as being, the only outcome that could ever exist for nuclear power generation. And so I would say that is a hurdle in terms of building support for advanced technologies or, potential valuable applications for it. I think a pivot in that perception is definitely fundamental to gaining broader support for nuclear, at least in a state like New York. So I think we do need to better understand the scale of the issues that advanced nuclear has an opportunity to address. What is the application profile? I'd say that's been a little vague to date. That's something just to think about from a messaging perspective. And also whether there's other externalities that we need to account for. For instance, are there like national security implications in this respect to ensure that the U.S. remains in the lead on this technology advancement? That's not also, I don't recall that as being part of the dialogue, but those are some examples of how at least I'm thinking about these issues.
No, that's a great summary. I think that was really interesting to hear all your different perspectives. I think what you touched on is everything from, there are some very local, like we mentioned, the public feeling it in the pocket, energy, you flick the light switch and it doesn't work. That's going to convince people pretty quickly, I think. But then equally at the other extreme, you've got the politician side, and I think like US leadership is something we definitely talk about within GAIN in terms of both the Office of Nuclear Energy with the National Nuclear Security Administration, NNSA, and State Department, and so on and so forth. So I think what's really interesting is that there's a different set of messaging depending on who we speak to. And I think it's important for nuclear not to just go in there and go, right, I've got a hammer, I'm going to hit you all with the same message, kind of beat you over the head with this thing. We've all got to kind of like listen. And I think that's what nuclear has really not been done a good job at, and that's listened. And it was great to hear all of your three perspectives, because you've been spending a lot of time listening and implementing these things. So I really appreciate that. So thank you very much. We're still pretty much on time. So again, I shan't screw that up and overrun any further. So thank you so very much for all of your presentations. It was really insightful and I think inspirational to really understand what's being implemented at the local levels all the way through to the bigger perspective from Zeke. So thank you very much on behalf of everybody. Really appreciate your time and contributions. So without further ado, we will move on to the session 2 of the afternoon. And unfortunately for everybody on the call, you're gonna have to listen to me for a little bit longer because that's me. So I introduced myself earlier. I'm Andy Worrell, the Deputy Director of GAIN, and I mentioned kind of got a broad set of interests and experience around different parts of the nuclear fuel cycle, reactor technologies, and energy policy and fuel cycle implementation. So this afternoon, the second session this afternoon is very much the next follow-on from that really well teed up discussion. The first session was really about the challenges and what we need to do around climate, the argument about carbon free. This next level, right, is kind of just drilling down a little bit more. And what we're really here looking to do is looking at, given we have these policy requirements, low or carbon free, whichever which language we wish to use, energy security, economics, all these other kind of phrases we used, how can we then best implement that, or sorry, evaluate that before we implement it? And so the remaining talk this afternoon very much focused around that, talking about, again, we'll start with Zeke shortly, talking about some of the net zero studies, what does it really tell us about the implementation? And then we'll roll on in our subsequent webinars later in the series, how we implement those assessments and kind of how does that manifest itself. So that's where we're moving on this afternoon. So Zeke, if you're able to pick up the reins again in terms of your next talk. So I will turn off my microphone and if I can do so, and hand over to you. So thanks, Zeke.
Sounds good. Thank you, and thank you guys for having me again for a second talk in this set of sessions. So if you go to the next slide, I don't need to introduce myself again. So I'm going to be talking a bit about some of these new net zero studies of using grid integration models that have come out in the last few months, and show sort of a quick inner comparison of the results from these different studies, look at where they agree and disagree, and what that might tell us about broader electricity decarbonization in the US. So if you go to the next slide, there's been recently 3 high-resolution grid integration modeling studies that have been published. These are by no means the only studies of this type, and so don't take this as comprehensive. They just happen to be 3 recent ones that tried to do fairly high-resolution assessment of generation siting, of transmission buildouts, of grid load profiles and how they'd be met in different future scenarios. And the 3 that I'm going to be discussing today are all envision getting the US economy as a whole to net zero emissions by 2050, both the electricity sector and transportation, industry, agriculture, everything across the entire economy. But in this talk, I'm going to be specifically looking at their electricity generation mixes, how they differ, what the assumptions in these studies are, and what they can tell us. And so the 3 studies that we are looking at here are the Princeton Net Zero Alliance study, led by a whole group of folks, including my friend Jesse Jenkins, who used to actually have my role at Breakthrough back in the day. And they use the energy pathways model and the Rio model together. They examine a range of scenarios, including a sort of their base or central scenario, which is called E+, which is one where there's high levels of electrification. But they also look at variants, including a low electrification scenario, E-, a low electrification high biomass or bioenergy scenario, E-B+, a high electrification low renewable energy scenario, E+RE-, and then a high electrification high renewable energy scenario. The second study that we looked at was Williams et al. 2021, which is called Carbon Neutral Pathways for the United States. It also uses the energy pathways in our Rio model, and they examine a wide range of scenarios, including the central, low fossil fuel prices, low renewable costs, low land, late electrification, low demand, 100% renewables, and net negative. And then finally, there's some initial results by Chris Clack's group, Vibrant Clean Energy, which is using a fairly different model, their sort of in-house wisdom model. Only the central scenario from that is available so far, but they are also going to be running, I believe, some additional scenarios. And so for this analysis, I'm going to be comparing the results from the E+, in the Net Zero Alliance, the central scenario in Williams et al., and the central scenario from Vibrant Energy 0 by 50 scenario. So if you go on to the next slide. And as I mentioned, these are all very high resolution grid integration models to the point at which they're actually citing individual generation resources. So this is an example from the Net Zero Alliance model looking at what the generation and land use around the city of St. Louis might look like in 2050 in their E+ scenario. So all of the orange things are solar farms, all of the sort of bluish squares are wind turbine areas. So the actual turbine central base is a tiny little dot that you can't really see in this graph, but the wider area is the area sort of used by the wind turbine installation. And so, these are very high resolution. They're, trying to take into account all the various trade-offs around land use, how to get the electricity from one place to another. If you go to the next slide, you can also see what the transmission assumptions in these sort of models look like. Next slide, please. There. So this is similarly both the footprint of different energy sources of wind and solar specifically in green and yellow, along with the new transmission build out required by 2050 in this model. And these are some pretty sizable grid buildouts. We're talking about 20, 50, and even 70 gigawatt transmission lines going from some parts of the country to others. And so this allows these models to, better send electricity from where it's generated to where it's needed effectively. And again, one of the challenges of looking at these sort of models and the limitation that we have to take into account is that, they are optimization models. They're, assuming there are some limitations around land use and things like that that are realistic, but at the same time, they're assuming a perfect world that doesn't really exist. Reality is probably going to be a bit more complicated. All models are wrong, but they can still be useful in looking at, what the future might look like. So if you go on to the next slide, here's the sort of main results from this analysis is comparing generation across these different models. So on the far left is the current generation mix for the US for current electricity generation. You can see it's coal, gas, non-CCS, gas with CCS, which doesn't exist today, nuclear, hydro, geothermal, and bioenergy, offshore wind, onshore wind, and solar. And then for 2030, 2040, and 2050, we're comparing the three different models, the Vibrant model, the Net Zero Alliance model, and the Williams et al. Model. And a couple interesting things stand out. First, there's a wide variety of differences in future energy demand across these models that reflect both assumptions around energy efficiency, but also the rate of electrification for the economy as a whole. The more of the economy you electrify, the more of transportation you electrify, the more of industrial processes you electrify, the larger the overall electricity demand is going to be. And so all of the models see a substantial expansion in US electricity demand, from a doubling of US electricity use by 2050 in the Vibrant model to a tripling of US electricity use by 2050 in the Williams et al. Model, with the Net Zero Alliance somewhere in the middle. Similarly, you have some pretty big differences in assumptions around future grid mixes here. Both Net Zero Alliance and Williams et al. Tend to have wind and solar being the dominant sources of generation, I think 80% and 90% respectively for the Net Zero Alliance and Williams et al. Whereas the Vibrant Clean Energy model sees a much larger role for nuclear, particularly advanced nuclear, as I'll discuss a little later, where nuclear is actually the single biggest source of energy generation of all the individual technologies by 2050, though it is smaller than wind and solar combined. So we still have, I think, a 55% variable renewable system overall here for the US as a whole, but advanced nuclear is playing a very large role there. In all of these models, well, in both Vibrant and Net Zero Alliance, I should say, there is a small chunk of gas with CCS, but it's not huge. And in both Net Zero Alliance and Williams et al., there's some residual gas without CCS generation that's offset by negative emissions and also blended with hydrogen through 2050 to help support system stability. One of the reasons why these models tend to not be super bullish on gas with CCS is essentially that the cost of the CCS gas plants means that the economics of running them very irregularly just to sort of balance out variable renewable generation becomes a lot harder versus conventional gas plants that don't have CCS because they're much lower capital costs. So they tend to not be particularly bullish on CCS for that reason. Next slide. So this chart shows the amount of variable energy and firm energy, not just clean, but total variable and firm energy across all three of the models. The dashed lines are the variable energy. The solid lines are the firm energy. In all three models, variable energy is the bulk of or the majority, I should say, of our generation by 2050. A bare majority in the case of the Vibrant model, a large majority in the case of Williams et al. And the Net Zero Alliance. But all three models also have a sizable remaining chunk of firm generation. These are not 100% variable renewable models by any stretch of the imagination. And so that is an important note. If you go on to the next slide. So as I mentioned, the Vibrant Clean Energy model, Chris Claff's group, is very bullish on advanced nuclear as part of the optimal decarbonization strategy. And in particular, they see a mix of small and modular reactors, which are in light pink in these load profiles, which can be, in their model at least, largely load following, so sort of replacing in part the role of natural gas in these systems, and molten salt reactors, which are the darker purple, which are more firm generation in this modeling. And so you can see these core charts break down the US average generation mix across a period of months in the winter, spring, summer, and fall in the year 2050. You can see the green is wind, the red is solar, and the purples are nuclear in this particular scenario. If you go on to the next slide. So there's also very different trajectories in these decarbonization models between coal and natural gas. In all three of the models, coal essentially falls off a cliff, getting to zero by 2030 or 2035 at the latest. While natural gas use decreases much more gradually, it actually remains roughly flat, close to today's levels through 2030, so for the next decade. Actually increasing slightly in the Williams et al. Model, and increasing through 2025 in the Net Zero Alliance model, but decreasing in the Vibrant model, before decreasing gradually through 2050, with some residual gas left in the Net Zero Alliance and Williams et al. Model. And if you go to the next slide, there is a real difference in these models between gas capacity, which actually stays pretty close to today's levels all the way through 2050, and the capacity factor for natural gas, which is shown by the dashed line, which declines, pretty rapidly over time, at least after 2030 or so. And so what you're seeing here is essentially, because there's so much variable renewable energy on the grid, you need a lot of backup gas capacity to deal with sort of extreme conditions of low variable renewable generation and high demand, similar in many ways to what we saw in Texas, where we had very low wind conditions and extreme demand due to the extreme cold temperatures. And so having a lot of gas capacity remaining, even if the utilization of that gas capacity is very, very low, allows these models to be much more flexible in incorporating large amounts of variable renewable energy. The exception, of course, is the Vibrant model, which is a lot less gas capacity, though still has a fair amount through 2045, in part because advanced nuclear is able to carry some of the weight the gas did. Obviously, it can't carry it all. You don't want to hugely overbuild your nuclear generation for these extreme demand events either. Gas is just a very convenient technology because it has low capital costs and most of its costs are operations to be able to have in reserve, even in a relatively high nuclear scenario like the Vibrant Clean Energy model. So if you go to the next slide. So there's a couple takeaways that are important from this intercomparison of models that I wanted to bring out. The first is that there's a need for clean, firm generation in lowest cost electricity sector decarbonization across all these models. Even if you're more bullish on renewables than nuclear, you're still seeing a sizable, residual gas capacity. You're seeing some gas with CCS, you're seeing hydro, you're seeing geothermal, you're seeing a lot of offshore wind in those models, because offshore wind is a much higher capacity factor than onshore wind, and it can be, a bit more reliable for grid planning and for load planning than onshore wind. Models tend to either use nuclear or green hydrogen blended with CH4 as sort of the main balancer for the grid, with a smaller role for gas at CCS, in part due to the high capital cost of gas at CCS plants and the fact that they can be relatively ill-suited for that reason for grid balancing. Deep decarbonization requires both speeding up deployment of existing clean energy technologies in all these models. So in all of these models, wind and solar is the primary driver of decarbonization in the next decade at least, or two. And they all see dramatic expansions of RD&D for clean, firm generation and hard to decarbonize sectors. Again, while this presentation focused on the power sector, there's a huge amount of technological innovation that's needed to deal with sectors like industrial heat, heavy freight, agriculture, et cetera, in addition to other solutions in the power sector to really let us move away from gas in the long term. As the Net Zero Alliance report puts it, the 2020s is the decade to invest in maturing and improving a range of technologies and improve the options for the long term. Exactly which one of those technologies is going to win out, if it's going to be green hydrogen, if it's going to be small modular reactors, if it's going to be enhanced geothermal, offshore wind, it's probably some combination of all of these, is unclear at this point, but we want to be fairly ecumenical in our approach to innovation at this point in time and sort of leave the options open, because as these models show, we don't know what the future is going to hold for our energy mix. 2050 is a long way off. We need more than what we just have today, and so there's a huge need to improve research, development, and deployment of these more nascent, firm, clean generation technologies today. And so there's three areas of model agreement that I want to focus on here. The first is the near-term importance of renewables deployment. It is very cheap today. There's relatively low penetration rates in a lot of states of renewables still. It can drive a lot of decarbonization in the near term, especially because, for better or worse, we're probably not going to be building a lot of current gen nuclear plants in the near term. In the medium term, there is an important role of gas capacity to fill in the gaps in a increasingly variable renewable system. And in the longer term, there's an importance of clean, firm generation and complementary technologies like battery storage, dramatically expanded transmission, better demand response, et cetera, to wean the power system off its dependence on natural gas. Because while you can have a high renewable, high gas system, it's a lot harder to have a high renewable, fully zero carbon system. Yeah, and if you go to the next slide, that is it for me.
Excellent, thanks, Nick. Yeah, I think what's really interesting there is you begin to see this kind of next level of detail, the devil's in the detail, right, really coming through. And then when you begin to see that map and the grid and where the grid's going to need to go, and where these things, where the markets are, and where the distribution centers need to be, it begins to really spark some interesting thoughts. And again, for anybody who, you know, maybe Zeke's over the last probably 5 to 10 years, there's been a tool developed on behalf of DOE Office of Nuclear Energy and also for EPRI about nuclear siting. So, you know, when you look at some of the regulatory requirements, but also proximity to populations, or you need to put nuclear near water, depending on the technology for cooling and so on, then suddenly you've got all this complex siting potential. So it's not as simple as, oh, let's just put them where we need them kind of thing. There's some constraints. So I think that's really quite a fascinating area to explore as we go forward. And again, understanding, you know, where can you put renewables versus nuclear might be different. So don't steal each other's optimal land and location, for example. So excellent. Thanks, Zeke. We'll come back to more. I'm sure there'll be some more questions in our Q&A at the end. So thanks for that. So the next speaker is Jordan Cox from NREL. So Jordan, are you there? Excellent, thanks, Jordan. So if you go ahead and want to introduce yourself, you can do as much or a little as you want from your bio. You know yourself as well as anybody. So and then over to you.
Hey everyone. So firstly, thank you so much for all the people who've talked before me. I really love this space. I think this is a really fun and interesting space, and I have some follow-up questions for Zeke because I'm going to talk about NREL's energy models today, and there are some points where we might see things a little differently, but I'm excited to discuss that. So my name is Jordan Cox. I'm a researcher at the National Renewable Energy Laboratory. For your information, I focus on energy security and resilience. So some of these questions around how do we design our electricity grid to withstand tail end events are my day-to-day job. But my PhD is actually in nuclear engineering. I studied and published on pellet bed gas-cooled reactors. And the reason that I ended up jumping over to the National Renewable Energy Laboratory is as I was coming up on the end of my graduate degree, I, like many people here, have heard about kind of the technical elegance of nuclear. And I really just was not understanding why these things weren't being built. And so I wanted to better understand markets and policy. So I took an internship here at NREL in the markets and policy kind of space, where I did solar energy policy and analysis for the first kind of year of my internship. And then I transitioned to a postdoc and now a full researcher. I still do a fair bit of work in energy policy and energy economics, but my focus now is energy security and resilience. So today I'm going to talk to you about some work that we did related to nuclear and energy economics. So I think we'll go ahead and go to the next slide, please. So the title of my presentation is Valuing Nuclear Energy and Energy Modeling. So I think we'll kind of go on from there. I'm going to talk about 4 things, and I assume I have about 15 minutes, so I might go a little bit fast, but I'm going to try to get to these 4 topics. One, there are a bunch of things I did not know about techno-economic analysis before I left grad school. And so just whenever I come to a nuclear focused audience, I talk a little bit about the basics, just the table stakes of what techno-economic analysis entails. From that, as you will see, this presents a very hard economic hardship case for nuclear energy. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that and just get into a little bit more of the disclaimers there. But from that, essentially 3 projects that I've had the opportunity to be involved in are research surrounding integrated energy systems, so nuclear energy tied with other energy sources to produce electricity and non-electric products, the NICE Future Initiative, or Nuclear Innovation Clean Energy Future Initiative, and the REED's long-term planning scenarios. So we'll go ahead and dive right in. So this slide is really important, and I want to start here. I know there are some people on this call who probably know the information I'm presenting, but I just want to start here so that you all kind of understand some of the things I focus on in my analysis, because it was a complete 180 from when I was kind of back doing my nuclear engineering and analysis work. The 3 terms that I really want to introduce today, or maybe 4, are levelized cost of electricity, discount rates, and net present value. So levelized cost of electricity is the first term, and essentially what it is if you take the sum of the costs of your power plant, something like a solar or wind or nuclear plant, you add them all together, and then you divide by the total amount of energy generated, you get the levelized cost of electricity. Now, levelized cost of electricity is pretty controversial because it is an overly simplified tool to estimate the value of energy. But the reason I start there is all the economic analysis we do builds upon that first step of estimating the dollar per megawatt hours that you can produce electricity from a particular plant from. After that, if you want to make your plant profitable, you start at your levelized cost of electricity, and then you go into where are you going to sell your energy product. And today I'm going to focus on electricity, but I want that to be kind of like the center of this conversation is where are we selling our energy product? Because I think that's something that I would really stress hard is something we need to think about a lot more when it comes to nuclear. So the next term I want to introduce is discount rates. Discount rates is an economic function that we use to estimate the value of present dollars versus future profits. And so when you are using a government-funded project, governments can borrow and use money at very low interest rates that are attractive to their rate of return. And that means they use very low discount rates in their calculations. But when you are talking about private equity, things like Silicon Valley investment, venture capital, they are not tolerant of long-term timeframes to regain their profits. This is because anyone who has money to put into capital has the opportunity to put it in lots of different places. And so when venture capital firms use their calculations to calculate the value of investing in something that will return over a long period of time, they use much higher discount rates. The difference between the discount rate used and the internal rate of return, so the rate of return is essentially how quickly you kind of get your money back. The difference between the discount rate and the internal rate of return that attracts private capital is called what we call the hurdle rate. So essentially, how much does my internal rate of return have to meet in order to be attractive to private investors? And I'm going to come back to that hurdle rate because I think there's something very particular as it applies to nuclear energy that I want to talk about in this analysis. The final thing is the net present value. So here I have a little graph. The x-axis is a unitless time period. So these could be years or months or decades or whatever. But essentially, if I want to calculate the net present value of a product, I start with my C0. You can see here it's a negative number, which is my capital cost. Then for each time period, I integrate all of my profits minus my costs, my fixed and my variable. I can even add in prices of carbon if I'm doing something around carbon emissions valuation. And that gives me my cash flow. For each time period, I take that cash flow and I divide by my discount rate raised to the power of that time period. So 1 plus d to the I. And that gives me, when I sum it all up, my net present value. So I'm going to talk about something. So I think we'll go ahead and go to the next slide. And that is electricity market restructuring. So for people who don't know, if you are in the United States, we have essentially two different types of electricity utilities. Pre the 1990s, most electricity utilities were vertically integrated, meaning these letters G, T, and D, generation, transmission, and distribution, were all controlled by an individual entity. They estimated the value of they estimated the increase of their load over the next several decades. They went to a PUC, they presented a plan, and then they charged their ratepayers a fixed rate kind of going forward to secure the cost, the capital to invest in that plan. Starting in the 90s, for some pretty justifiable reasons, we began restructuring and liberalizing our electricity markets. In this restructured, this competitive market, kind of the bottom two categories here, it is illegal for many transmission authorities, independent system operators, and balancing authorities to own generation. So see how this G is kind of separated from the T and D? Essentially, when a utility wants to procure new generation, they have to release a competitive RFP that allows different generators, private independent power producers, IPP, to bid into that RFP. So now I want to just pause and call out something that I think is really important. If you'll notice, Vogtle is being financed the same way we used to finance vertically integrated utilities, with a discount rate and its economics of around 2 to 4%. Suddenly, the fact that nuclear energy has to be competitive in kind of this new space means that if we use a discount rate of 20 to 24%, the fact that nuclear energy lasts for 40, 50, or 60 years, when you discount that to present value, almost has no bearance on its net present value. And so I want to pause here and just lay out a couple caveats. Usually when I give presentations like these, I get just a couple nasty emails of things, and I just want to throw it out there. I do not control electricity markets. You are welcome to email me, nothing will change. This is just the way things are changing. And I'm not going to, as a researcher for the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, state that this is either good or bad. It's not my place to make policy. It is my place to understand how this affects the flow of private capital into independent power purchasers and the attractive rate of return that we need to secure for energy products to get people to build these things. So I want to just pause there and really say, This is just kind of a statement of how the industry and utility space works. And we have to figure out how to make nuclear competitive in this space. So I'm going to go ahead and ask you to go ahead in 2 slides because I only have 15 minutes. I want to jump ahead to kind of this graph. So let's talk about the problem. So starting in 2011, due to the price decrease of things like natural gas and renewables, both of which put downward forces on the overall electricity price in the United States, we can take the full 8,760 hours. So if you take 24 by 365, you get 8,760 hours, and we can line up electricity prices. So this is the electricity prices for 3 hubs in the southwest region of the United States, NI Hub in 2017, SPS, and Palo Verde. And most importantly, what we know is that nuclear energy produces electricity at a price of around $25 to $40, maybe even $55 per megawatt hour. If that is the price of your production, and these are the electricity prices, we can essentially integrate this and say up to 35% of the time, existing nuclear reactors are losing money while they're selling in to the wholesale baseload electricity market. This means that many of our existing nuclear reactors are facing economic hardship. And again, I just want to reiterate, I am not saying that this is the way electricity market should be. I am not advocating for policy to restructure or change things. I'm just saying, when you take the prices that electricity markets currently are offering to nuclear reactors are beginning to lose money more and more of the time. As someone who values the non-economic values of nuclear, like its carbon-free aspects, I think this is a problem. And so my question is, how do we change this? How do we make nuclear economics more competitive? So let's go ahead and go to the next slide. So before I got to NREL, one of the projects that had started that I was able to do some work with, which is really cool, is looking at integrated energy systems. This is a project that was launched in collaboration with the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, Idaho National Laboratories, and the National Energy Technology Laboratory, where we began to say, what if we started augmenting nuclear reactors with some sort of product where they operated in tandem with renewables to provide thermal and electrical energy to non-electric products. We'll go ahead and go to the next slide, please. So, I have included the citations here. You're welcome to check it out and kind of see what you think from these reports, but I want to just highlight the key findings of the main parts of this report. The system that was kind of one of the ones that is most talked about is the case where you had a nuclear plant, a steam generation unit, a wind power plant, and a low temperature electrolyzer. So what happened is when the price of electricity was lower, they sold energy directly to the low temperature electrolysis and generated a valuable product in the form of hydrogen. When the electricity price was higher, then they sold energy back to the grid in order to keep making money off of selling electricity. But here's the thing that I just kind of want to focus in on this piece of analysis. The amount of hours during the year with which you were able to flex back and forth is directly related to the capital cost of your system augmentation. So the higher the cost of the electrolyzer, the less amount of times you can divert energy away from it and still make economic sense. So the cases where the nuclear energy was most economically competitive were cases where nuclear energy was able to work in partnership with renewable energy flexibly to divert energy to a low capital cost, high value stream external product. And so I want to really hone in on this. I work a lot in this space of working between nuclear and renewable people. It's very fun. I love it. I want to be just clear, I love these communities a lot. The best value case that we found when we looked at this type of stuff is when nuclear and renewable energy work together to provide both electric and non-electric products flexibly. And so I just want to put that out there for just a second while we continue on. So let's go ahead and move forward. So because of the value of this work, it was decided that there was a space to do more research surrounding the flexibility of nuclear energy. From that, an organization was created called the Nuclear Innovation Clean Energy Future Initiative, or the NICE Future Initiative, which is an initiative under the Clean Energy Ministerial, which seeks to, on the international scale, spread information about the value of nuclear renewable technologies working together in a clean energy system. So looking at this slide, I think this is really kind of interesting and awesome. I stole this slide from INL with accreditation, so I'm going to just flag any of our INL participants who are on the call. This is the goal of the NICE Future Initiative, to examine how nuclear reactors, renewable energy could work together to produce high-value products that include both electric and non-electric applications. So I want to keep going. We'll go ahead and go to the next slide with just a couple more minutes left here. So from this work, we did a bit of research into our long-term energy planning scenarios. So at NREL, we operate the regional energy deployment system. This is pretty similar in a lot of ways to Zeke's analysis, or some of the models Zeke's looked at. We slice the country up into different balancing authorities and regions. We then have each region with a load and a transmission capacity, and that region has to either meet their load with resources generated that can be wind and solar, right, based upon lower renewable energy portfolios or other energy sources, or it can import or export electricity. And for representative time slices from now through 2050, we try to examine, and this is very important, the lowest cost optimized energy mix that meets future energy demand. Couple things here. One, this analysis does not include non-electric products. Two, it assumes perfect knowledge and rational behavior. So if we look at, the different utility spaces, we assume that everyone tries to meet their demand with the lowest cost option. And three, it doesn't assume any sort of centralized, decision-making authority on it. It just focuses on how the balancing energy either purchases electricity from other regions or generates it or sells it. So we'll go ahead and go to the next slide. So we wanted to look at what are the variables that affect nuclear deployment through 2050. So again, we're taking that flexible nuclear work and asking, when do we see it deployed? So we looked at about 7 different scenarios. We first looked at a base case with an 80-year extension of nuclear reactor licenses. We then looked at capital cost reduction. Now I want to pause here for just a second because I think this is really important and was a tad glossed over in previous work and some of the previous, which is not to say those discussions are bad, but this is something that I wanted to really hone in on. The single biggest variable we see in the results is that the results are highly sensitive to reductions in the capital cost of nuclear energy. Before I kind of worked in the energy economic space, I had heard the phrase nuclear energy is expensive. And I never really understood what that means, but I do want to say nuclear energy is currently very expensive. So natural gas, in terms of overnight capital cost, in terms of its dollars per kilowatt, is about $900. Onshore wind is approximately $1,400, solar is $900, nuclear today is $6,000. And you may think, oh, that sounds really high. When we take into account Vogtle, that number might even be a bit low. And we're going to talk about the results a little bit here, but I want to just mention this. The single biggest factor was in our analysis that led to nuclear deployment was, does nuclear energy see a reduction in capital cost? And I want to flag that. So we ran 5 different scenarios that were sensitive to capital costs, looking at $5,000, $4,000, $3,000, $2,000, and $1,500 per kilowatt installed capital cost. And so essentially what we did here is we tried to see how much does nuclear energy have to decrease in cost in order to become a major player in the future energy grid. The other 4 cases we looked at were 1, where flexible nuclear energy was allowed to operate flexibly. 2, renewable energy decreases in prices faster than expected. So we have a high level of VRE penetration such that we're wondering, does flexible nuclear energy help when we have more renewable energy on the grid, variable renewable energy that is. We looked at flexible plus high VRE, and then finally we looked at a low emission scenario where it's required by 2050 to reduce our emissions by 95%. Just want to reiterate, this is an electricity-only study. It does not incorporate economy-wide impacts. We'll go to the next slide and we'll be at our results. So I want to talk through these results and I want to just make sure to layer on a bunch of caveats. So firstly, without cost reductions, if nuclear energy sees no innovations, our model predicts nothing but a decline in the amount of nuclear capacity on the US electricity grid. From where we're at today, without relicensing, some estimates even put it down as low as 40 gigawatts. And I want to just be clear about this. Again, I love all forms of clean energy, and I'm not trying to attack or deride anything. But we have to take into account the fact that nuclear energy is currently expensive, and we need to focus on the capital cost of nuclear energy as being a determinant factor. Now, does it need to be as low as our model says? Absolutely not, because again, this model takes into account a lot of non-economic values. So I want to frame that. That's kind of the base case. If you look to the far left, you see without cost reductions, nuclear energy sits at about 90 gigawatts from now through 2050. The case with the highest nuclear deployment, which is the one I'm guessing that people are most interested in, is the case where we have both an emissions reduction scenario and nuclear energy experiencing significant cost reductions. In this case, this is the case to the far right, we see about 200% deployment increase in deployment of nuclear energy from now through 2050. We see nuclear energy working with renewables to provide clean energy across the energy grid, and nuclear energy operating flexibly. The other couple things I wanted to just point out really fast is without some form of cost reduction, and I think this has been alluded to in the other points, the emissions reductions still happen. We just see in our models natural gas with carbon capture filling that role. And so, I mentioned, I think Zeke talked about the Vibrant model, and there are kind of a lot of different things. We estimate the capital cost of natural gas with carbon capture about $1,700 per kilowatt. And so, there's some real tension there around the roles that the different energy sources can play. But if we look at the case where there's no carbon emissions reductions, kind of the second best case for nuclear, I would say, the best case that we see kind of coming out from this are these cases where nuclear energy both increases or decreases its capital cost of installation and operates flexibly in tandem with renewable energy. I'll go to my last slide and I'll kind of just talk about the conclusions really fast because I think I am a little bit over here, but I want to run through these. Sorry, we'll go back one. So just again, going to layer on these caveats. Long-term energy models do not incorporate non-economic values. We can try to incorporate them through some way of alchemizing them to economic inputs to our REITs model, but we don't look at things like energy security or the value of diversity of energy mixes. I do a lot with resilience, and we're working on that, but that's a thing that's kind of very interesting in there. Two, the modeling presented here shows two areas where nuclear energy sees significant deployment, and that is where it achieves strong cost reductions. Again, because we're not taking into account all those non-economic values, the cost reductions shown here are probably more drastic than need to be achieved. There are probably utilities who are willing to pay a bit of a premium for nuclear. That's not for me to say, that's just kind of where we're at. But we see that when nuclear achieves very low cost reductions, it works in tandem with renewable energy, and we have some sort of impetus for emissions reductions, which is not a guarantee. Nuclear energy sees the most deployment. Renewable energy, due to its nature, is relatively insensitive to cost. And here's what that means. The thing about solar energy is that because it is really cheap now, you build as much of it as you can without curtailing. So even if solar energy doesn't decrease as fast as we expect, you build a lot of it. Once you get to the point where you're curtailing solar energy, it doesn't matter how much the solar panels get cheaper. It really is affected by the cost of energy storage or the cost of kind of those firm resources that we talked about that compensate for the variability. So in a lot of the simulations we looked at, renewable energy hits about 60% of our primary electricity supply and really stalls out. Even in cases where it gets very cheap, it's much more sensitive to what source you use to back it up, because people always say, like, it's variable, you don't understand. I was like, yes, we understand. When the wind is blowing and the sun is shining, we are cheap. When it's not, we're either curtailing or overbuilding. We're doing something to compensate for that, and we account for that. So renewable energy has hit a point where it's cheap enough that we kind of get to a point and then it stops being built depending upon how we can store it. And then I think I've said all the caveats, but I'll just repeat them again. There are lots of non-economic factors here. I have some couple ideas, but I thought I had just a bit more time. I think I'll just stop there and just say, really, really love this work and excited to do more of it in the future. I have some future work planned.
Excellent, thanks, Sean. Yeah, we'll certainly come back and have some Q&A. So back to your questions you might have had for Zeke, so we'll pick those up later in the Q&A. So thanks very much for that. Really insightful, good studies. Okay, so we'll move on to the third speaker in this session, and that's Zainab Dungawala and from Palo Verde. So over to you, Zainab. Can you hear? Yeah, there you are.
Yeah, I can hear you. Can you see me?
Yes, all good. Thank you so much.
Perfect. So I really appreciate going kind of last in this deck, because what I'm here to speak about is really a focus on seeing all of these models, understanding if you're a new business or even an established business, what is that next step that you take, and how do you really digest this information to really figure out what the strategic actions are. But first, just a little bit about me. I work as an energy policy and business strategy executive advisor at Palo Verde Generating Station. And so I'm out in sunny Phoenix, Arizona, and yet I'm still wearing a sweater because it's under 100 degrees. I have worked both on the nuclear side as well as the broader utility strategic foresight side. So that's under Arizona Public Service. I've worked with the National Renewable Energy Lab. I hope to have more engagement in the future, so hint on that. I've also co-presented with Dr. Cynthia Celine on kind of what are the futures and the decisions that can be made in the nuclear space. I've had the opportunity to lecture at a couple different universities and also be involved in a really exciting project with the IAEA. But with that, we can go ahead and get started on the next slide. And next one, sorry. So we all know, after seeing all of these different presentations, that the world is simply changing. So just some questions to kind of kick off. Have you ever wondered how the World Economic Forum plans for complex global issues, such as the AIDS epidemic, or why BMW is working on a hydrogen vehicle, or maybe even why Shell, which is a traditional oil and gas company, is buying up vehicle charging infrastructure? So something that they all have in common is that they use a process that focuses on strategic foresight. And it's actually something that's used by over half of Fortune 500 companies. And what it allows them to do is not only kind of navigate how our future's unfolding, but to be successful and to thrive in that future. And this is where this process becomes really interesting for a business. Next slide. So just an indication that the world is really changing. It's becoming a lot more complex, a lot more uncertain. And we see this really trickling over into the energy environment. Next slide. So here's just an example of one headline. So this is from IEEE. I opened up their newsletter and it said, paper batteries charged with bacteria could power the Internet of Things. And so in this instance, they were kind of cataloging some details about the creation of a cheap, sustainable, single-use battery to power billions of sensors and devices. What was interesting here is the sustainability story, which is the bacteria will both generate an electric current and devour the battery at the end of its useful life. You might be thinking, what does this have to do with nuclear power? So this is kind of where it transitioned into me thinking about that. What we find is that there's going to be more than 50 billion electronic devices that will be deployed over the next 5 years. This is going to be a substantial amount of data. This data will most likely sit in data centers. And so again, that question, what does this mean for nuclear power? My initial thought is, well, can we supply that as a part of the nuclear industry? Can we supply the power needed? But when you start to dive into this trend a little more, what you find is they're typically asking for renewable only solutions when they go and locate in these different regions across the US. So next slide. So again, that was just one example of many out there. And what it really shows is that there are these big questions about what disruptive change really is. And so when I read these different headlines and I see these different papers, and specifically on this webinar, see all these different ways that a clean energy future has been modeled, I start to ask myself, what are these new opportunities and new threats that are really emerging here? What do these trends mean for us in the nuclear industry? And most importantly, how can nuclear power best prepare for that changing energy landscape? Next slide. And so in kind of my kind of history of going through figuring out what these different options are, at Palo Verde Generating Station and really for the nuclear industry as a whole, this is where I was introduced to something called scenario planning. It's a process that's taught at Oxford University, but it's also something that is widely used in the World Economic Forum and in lots of other forums and companies to figure out what do you do next. So next slide. What we can all agree on is that the energy industry is rapidly changing across social, technical, economic, environmental, and political spheres. What you heard earlier is that in a lot of these models, we build in some stuff, such as the technical side or the economic side, but it's harder to really build in that social side or environmental trends, and sometimes also the political side of things. And so if you look at my diagram on the right, what I typically like to show people is that if you're talking about the utility environment, for a very long time, if you look at the x-axis, we've really been in this low to medium uncertainty zone. And so it's been really okay for us to kind of, figure out what to do next based on forecasts and predictions alone. And then if you look at the y-axis for complexity, we've also been in that kind of low to medium zone as far as the utility energy side of things. And so again, forecasts and predictions were okay here. But because there's so much disruption and there's so much uncertainty at this point, we don't even know if big generators have a place in the future as things decentralize more. It really begs us to use or add on another tool. And again, this is scenario planning. Now, what gets really uncomfortable for people here is that you're asking them, and me included, to go from something that's probability based, and so this is your forecast, your predictions, it's numbers based, to scenarios which simply just ask you to pause and think about plausibility. You ask yourself what could happen, and from there you can work backwards, you can create these models, but you have to take pause and think about what those scenarios might be. Now, there are a couple benefits that we've always had out of this type of exercise. It helps widen the lens to the changing world. It helps one really go beyond straight line future projections, which you see many of. And most importantly, I think for people on the line, it helps to acknowledge and design for complex disruption ahead. Next slide. So just a simple diagram to kind of drive home this idea. What you typically see is forecasting, which is kind of that yellow part of the diagram in the middle. You base your forecast on what you know today, and then you project to the future. And for good measure, you know, a lot of us are engineers on the line, you say plus or minus 10%. So you could think about, you know, if you're sitting at a nuclear plant, you might say, I do a plus or minus 10% on energy pricing. And so, you know, you then put your strategic plans together and you march towards that future. The thing is that if you were to ask me, say 10 years ago, if hydrogen would be something we'd be talking about producing from a nuclear plant, I wouldn't have had a clue. And I think many on the line would agree with me. So this is where scenario planning becomes really, really helpful. And so in scenario planning, which is on that right part of the diagram, what you really acknowledge to yourself is, yeah, I have some knowns, but I also have some unknowns. And so I have to acknowledge that there's this uncomfortable elephant in the room, and I don't know, you know, what color it is, how big it is, how fast it will charge at us. And so what you do in this process is you imagine these multiple plausible futures. And so you might say, you know, there's something with electricity, or there's something with decentralization, or climate change policy changes. But what you really do from here is you then sit in the current day, and as you make a business decision for your company, you ask yourself, though I don't have a crystal ball, where do my choices really fall? So in one scenario, it might be a great choice. In another scenario, it might be a terrible choice. And that's something that you have to have a conversation about in a business environment. Next slide. So I'll give you a simple example of kind of, you know, proof that really the future will be different from the past. And we seem to miss this a lot. And so what you're seeing here is a diagram from Shell. And that kind of deeper, darker, or not darker, but kind of the thicker line there is the actual price of oil per barrel over the years. So starting in 1970 and kind of projecting or actual numbers out from there. What you also see kind of jetting off to the right are those predictions of pricing that were made over certain different years there. What you can probably first tell is that there's a positive bias here. And so the question is, why were they so wrong? Why were the predictions always going up, but the actual price is always going down? And so next slide. Just taking the first area there, you can see that they were kind of blindsided by the second oil crisis, the Iranian Revolution. And if you look at that second bump there, kind of everybody was caught off guard with falling demand and increased production. And so this really made them at Shell and other companies start to think there's got to be a better way to plan the future success of our company. Next slide. So an example of how this can go wrong. So GE is an extremely well respected company. They have fantastic engineers, you know, great expertise. But what happened, and you know, you see this in many industries, is they were very focused on making the best gas turbines out there. And while they were doing that, while they were redirecting a lot of their funds in that region, they kind of missed how quickly you know, the clean energy transition was really coming. And what this resulted in was it cost their investors almost $193 billion. So just missing the speed at which change is happening and not keeping an eye on it can be detrimental for a company's success. Next slide. So really just to kind of wrap up that we need a new approach. You know, The world is not static. And so our approach and our strategies have to keep adapting. The models that you saw earlier will change next year. There'll be new inputs, new ideas of how to model things. Next slide. What we're really doing in this process is thinking about these broad shifts that have direct influence on where the nuclear space goes. And so this means we have to keep our eye on a number of things, such as the speed of digitization, the transformation of the grid, electrification, energy policy, market values, and it goes on and on. There's just a few on this slide. Next slide. The reason why you really have to spend ample time studying this is because what you're trying to drive at is to understand what that complex kind of tapestry of things looks like, so that you can answer what are the main external factors which will shape the future of nuclear power in 2040 or maybe 2050, and what are those big picture changes that may influence the energy landscape. This is kind of the bread and butter of what is being discussed in many different executive meetings, because we need to simply wrap our head around this before we make a decision. Next step, or next slide. So you can picture nuclear power strategy as this airplane, and you can picture these different scenarios as kind of those wind patterns that you are basically deploying here. What you're really looking for in these different scenarios is, do the wings fall off, or is the airplane quite robust in design? And what you're driving at is, are there any pros and cons to each of these type of worlds, these plausible futures that you've envisioned? Where are we vulnerable? Because there could be something we could design a little differently or prepare for differently. And where are the new opportunities? This part is really special in this process. Next slide. What it really helps you do, and it helped me do, is it helped me shift from being reactive to, say, Jordan's presentation about, kind of where nuclear power sits and the pricing sits, to thinking more proactively. Again, from the business side, it helps you really identify where those new partnerships are. It helps you inspire technical collaboration, because you can show others how you arrived at your idea and bring them along with you. You can learn from your competitors, and you can really lead those crucial discussions to cause the change that we need. Next slide. So I'll leave you with one example, just a couple of trends that are emerging that are getting attention. Next slide. So Microsoft recently announced that by 2030, they want to be carbon negative. And this is a really impressive goal. But what got even more attention is their 2050 goal. By 2050, they want to remove all carbon the company has emitted directly or indirectly since 1975. This is the start of this company. This is an enormous lift. And what they've done to make sure that people know that they're serious is they have a $1 billion climate innovation fund that they plan to deploy in 4 years. What they're looking for are projects from others to collaborate on carbon reduction, carbon capture, and carbon removal. And so just that's one indication. Next slide to see another kind of similar indication out there. It was noted kind of earlier in some of this modeling that when they talk about negative carbon tech, a lot of times you see in these models that they're building out bioenergy with carbon capture and storage. Now, this is heavily relied on in UN IPCC climate modeling. You also see in other models like you did earlier today. Essentially, it's CO2 captured and injected into the deep geological formations that you can see on that diagram. But all to say that if you actually scale this up in some of these more extreme scenarios, what you find is that you would need the land size of India or larger, and you would have a direct conflict with food production. And this also would use a high amount of water. The problems here is that we already have challenges with food security and water security around the world. And so if you just take pause here with this last slide, just think, is there something here? Is there an opportunity? And so where my brain goes is there could be something there for nuclear power, partnered with direct air capture. And I found out while, simply scrolling through LinkedIn that this idea has already, been arrived at in the UK with the Sizewell C project, where they actually recently issued an RFP, a request for proposal, on this exact idea. And I'm finding other university professors who are also just taking the first steps to study this as a potential solution of the many that are out there. So with that, next slide. I promise it's the end. I know we're over time.
No, you're fine.
But thank you. Thank you.
No, thanks, Anna. Very good. Appreciate your insight and your kind of a new way of thinking. That new philosophy of being proactive, I think, is incredibly important for sure. So yeah, if all of the speakers from the last session could come back on. There's Jordan. I was waiting for Jordan to pop on. That's excellent. So we have a few questions, and I know Jordan probably had some from Zeke, but if you can hold your questions, Jordan, and I'll just touch on one or two of the others that came in too, if I may. There was a couple, actually, I think, in relation to some of Jordan's work. There were specific, so I'll pick up on those first, if I may. The question was, where's it gone? There was one, oh yeah. Does NREL have a recommendation for discount rates where energy supply would be otherwise unavailable, such as if there were a fossil fuel ban? For instance, to make an allegory to transportation projects, if there is no bridge to where we need to be, does a tight hurdle rate mandate municipal investment to secure a low cost of capital?
Yeah, so I think there were a couple questions in there, and I'm not sure if it was worded exactly how the author meant it. So I guess I'll take it and kind of talk about what I think is most interesting in this case.
Do the politicians thing. Answer a different question, Jordan. Go on.
Yeah. So I'm just going to mention two things about discount rates and return on investments. So one, first thing is sometimes so the difference between LCOE and net present value is essentially how much money you can make by selling your energy product versus how much you can generate it for. And so one of the things I'll say is, a lot of times I hear nuclear people talk about their base load. And I always find this funny because base load electricity is the lowest compensated, slimmest margin energy product. And so if you're an industry who has a high LCOE that likely has a lower barrier due to the fact that nuclear reactors do require licensing, do require more stringent safety standards than many other forces, you probably want to aim for energy products that are like the good stuff, right? Like high quality energy products. And so sometimes I wonder, going back to your question about discount rates, I'll just give an example. For natural gas and solar plants, they have a return on investment somewhere between 12 to like 25%. Nuclear reactors, much lower, right? Because they have a longer lifetime. I wonder if we want to make a good return on investment and our LCOE can only get to a certain point, what would it look like if the nuclear industry were focused on delivering high value energy products rather than the base load energy products that are kind of like the lowest compensated and slimmest margins? What I'll add on that is I hear a lot of talk about nuclear innovation. Sometimes I wish I heard talk about financial innovation. Some of the things that were big solvers in the renewable energy industry with the power purchasing agreement, where they essentially created loans that sold energy products at a lower price than wholesale electricity so they could guarantee the loans, but then created a higher return on investment for their investors over the lifetime of their product. I wonder what would it look like if we had a nuclear energy financing index fund where like people could invest in a bulk fund that helps all the nuclear reactors get licensed and then have return on investment if one of them gets licensed. I wonder about financial innovation that solves this problem of the discount rate, the rate of return, and the kind of lower ceiling LCOE. But I'll stop there.
Yeah, no, I think just very quickly on that, Jordan, I think the other thing as well is certainly doing these kind of assessments for UK government back, it's like 15, 20 years ago now. But, one of the big things about the internal rate of return is the investors' perception of risk, right? So the higher the risk, the more the return they want to get, because if they're going to back something that's a bit risky, they want to, be willing to take that risk only if it's got a greater level of return. And I think there's the other thing as well, perhaps, again, this is a big if, but if nuclear technology can demonstrate its ability to build more quickly, operate more quickly, less risk on licensing, less risk on cost overruns, and so on and so forth. And that's where we begin to start getting towards like the SMR world. So a paradigm shift in technology could be the catalyst for a paradigm shift in some of the investment profile and the required return on investment just because of risk. So that could be something that comes. So it's an interesting. There is a linkage, I think, between the technology and the interest rates, assumed interest rates. Question to Zeke was, how about the question? I might get this wrong, but it says, how about life cycle cost of wind and solar and demand on natural resources? I guess what it's saying is that if there's a greater life cycle, greater demand on cost of wind, solar and wind, then the demand on natural resources goes up and so forth. Any thoughts and comments on that, Zeke, in terms of your analysis?
Yeah, it's funny. We're actually working on a peer-reviewed paper on that very subject right now, looking at, if you take some of these global integrated assessment models that have very rapid build out of new energy technologies to meet 1.5 or 2 degree scenarios, what is all the materials required for that? What is the embodied energy in producing those materials? What are the embodied emissions in producing those? So, I can give you a tiny sneak peek, which is that it's real, but it's not that big compared to the other things that we use resources for. At the end of the day, the biggest resources you end up having for renewables, just in terms of volume and embodied emissions, are generally concrete and steel. And concrete and steel and renewables is pretty tiny compared to the amount used in the building industry, even if you have these very, very rapid decarbonization scenarios. So it is real, it's a concern. And you definitely get some concerns around things like neodymium and some of these very aggressive scenarios in terms of supply, not necessarily embodied emissions and energy, but just actually getting enough of some of these rare earth materials. But at the same time, we've seen a lot of examples of substitution in energy technologies already. Cobalt has been phased out of a lot of battery technologies because of the cost of it, and so you can make wind turbine magnets with less or no neodymium. And so I'm not too worried about constraints on the rare earth supply side really holding back the energy transition for any of these technologies, or a huge amount of embodied emissions being required. Like it's small compared to all of the other emissions we have today.
Okay, that's good, thank you. Actually, a response came in, Jordan, in terms of the nuclear index fund. That will be amazing, but investment firms such as HSBC need guidance on how to structure and qualify nuclear investment products. HSBC climate bonds exclude nuclear for a lack of qualifying standards. So I think your idea is a good one. It's being picked up, but unfortunately there's gaps from nuclear, which is all too often.
I'm just going to say something in one quick response to that, Andy.
Yeah.
At the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, we employ full-time 30 to 40 researchers who research markets, policies, and financial innovation. And that is something that attracted me to NREL. We spend time understanding how markets and policies affect our deployment. And I think more research should be done to publish papers showing how novel financing mechanisms could lead to reducing risk of nuclear, even physically constrained by long construction times. Like, there is financial innovation to occur. The renewables people did a lot of it, and that's really cool. I'm not saying renewables people have the answers. They have their own struggles. I love to listen to talking to them, but we spend a lot of time and money paying people to research markets, policy, and financing mechanisms. So
yeah,
that's a
no good. No, I think that's a great takeaway. Actually, that's a really good observation. I say I think innovation in more areas than just the technology is absolutely key. And I know this is something that Christine wanted to ensure that we start the dialogue as a much more kind of a broader community, not just the technology people or just the nuclear people talking about the same things. It's about this broader conversation. So I think that's a great takeaway. Actually, Zeynep, from your perspective, Zeynep, from your kind of operational perspective and your strategizing, is anything in your strategies, like your use of the word proactive was really interesting. Any thoughts in terms of response to Jordan's suggestion there from your experience as to what you could do, or your organization or your strategic thinking may be able to help on that?
Yeah, I mean, so I always harp on scenario planning, that kind of the Oxford scenario planning method being a great way to structure those conversations and kind of understand what are those big trends that are driving people's decision making. And so you just take a big company like the one I work at. I've got people who specialize in resource planning, finances, engineering, but we all speak different languages. But if you come together and you use a process like scenario planning, you can start to figure out what are those kind of cross-tie solutions, something that hits on the tech side, but also on the finance side. Because done in isolation, I always go back to, I was an INC design engineer. And if you'd asked me what innovative idea I had at that point, I would say, I don't know, make the control systems better and cheaper, right? It's a very isolated solution. Mm-hmm. But you start to broaden that experience and broaden that lens and bring in all these experts to the table, and you can have these deeper conversations and get collaboration going to figure out how does one innovate financial mechanisms that could help us with things we're seeing on the tech side.
No, excellent point. I think we've probably got time for one or two quick other questions. There was another one that came in, again, Jordan, this related to you, I think primarily was, the modeling that's done is all based for on the US. Are the economics the same in Europe or other parts of the world about low cost of nuclear, or are there substantial differences that would drive different trends to those seen?
Yeah, and I overrode a bit of my time, so I actually want to cede as much time as I can back to Zainab because I love her work. I've talked to her before. So I do want to say that our modeling is applicable only for the United States. We do make reads versions that are applicable outside the United States. I do love reading our modeling because it gives me the ability to look at other country models and understand the assumptions quickly. But our modeling is just applicable to the United States, and the economic, energy markets, policies, and utility structure in other countries is completely different.
So, okay, excellent. Thanks for that. So I know, Jordan, you said you had a question. Is there anything you wanted to flag with Zeke, or well, you mentioned that you've referenced Adam now, so you can ask if there's anything you want to ask them or vice versa. While I'm just going back through the other questions.
Yeah, I'll just toss one over to Zainab because I think it's really important. So I think I work on resilience, energy security, and try to take in known probabilities to try to estimate system damages based upon historical data. It's the thing I do. In my field, there's been a new emergence of a thing called decision-making under deep uncertainty, where the probability is unknown. I guess for engineers who are uncomfortable with unknown unknowns, how do you quantitatively take that into account in some of the scenario planning exercises?
So that's why I was very careful, you know, on that slide where I say that we did, or I mean, a lot of us still do, we rely a lot on those forecasts, but we need to add this other tool, scenario planning. But the key is that scenario planning makes you figure out what's plausible, but then you can come back to the safe numbers. You know, my whole background is in engineering. And so for me, the reason I stepped into this is because I simply wanted to understand how were decisions being made, where were partnerships that needed to be formed to leverage new solutions. But once you do that, you can step back into numbers and you can be more comfortable, you know, as many of us are engineers by our start. And so you take a very, very technical organization, you know, like nuclear engineering at Palo Verde. And so you have to bring it back into that area of plausibility, but then also into the modeling and the numbers. And so I know a lot of people have mentioned here that they work with E3. It's no surprise all utilities are working also with E3. But we first have to ask ourselves, are we even modeling the right things? Hopefully that answers your question.
I think just one thing that's interesting, again, kind of from reactor operations or a fuel cycle modeling perspective, which I think, but I think the observation still holds, and that is, Jordan, you know, sometimes when you don't know how big the uncertainties are, it's worth doing like a parametric study on every one of those, you know, within a certain distribution and so forth, because you can then very quickly learn, well, A, what's important, and B, what can I control that's important. And then it just helps focus the mind a little bit, I think, on as to where we should be going after. And I think that's something with those kind of uncertainty analysis. I think it's really quite fascinating, because otherwise we just kind of like, oh, well, this is exciting, I'm going to go after this. Well, that exciting thing may not actually be the thing that's the most important part of that. And just one other quick observation before I forget, I meant to mention this earlier. Your hurdle rate comment was really interesting. That when I worked for the UK nuclear industry, I remember an actual decision just based on internal rate of return ended up being that a plant was built, was about to go through active commissioning, as this is not a nuclear reactor but a nuclear fuel cycle facility, was about to go actively commissioned, go live. They redid the economics based on how much time and the market had changed. And because the IRR now, I'm going to make it up, but literally instead of being 12% was now only 10, they just canned the whole thing. And so it's interesting that kind of hurdle rate sounds like a hypothetical modeling kind of thing, but it's actually really used in, you know, in real decision making. Again, Zainab, you may have, you know, I don't know if you've been around the boardroom tables where those kind of decisions are, you know, it's a go no go based on returns. You know, it's quite fascinating. It does really happen. Okay, I think I'm just conscious of the time because I think we're getting to that stage where we just need to do the last little bit on the energy calculator for GAIN. So if there's no more questions, I've been watching any more questions come in. I didn't see any more. No. So there's no more questions. What we will do though is we're going to collate all the questions, and so if there's anything that we haven't addressed or hasn't been touched on, we'll come back to people and get a response. So again, thank you to the three of you for your presentations. Really appreciate it. And then and your time and your insights really kind of triggered off a lot of good questions and thoughts. So thanks very much again on behalf of GAIN and the audience. So thank you. Okay, so let's we'll move on now to the energy calculator. So what we're going to be talking about now is, if you like, how GAIN is looking to implement some of this kind of like thinking a little bit from a GAIN perspective. And so one of the things that we've recognized, and I think we probably all recognized, is the kind of the role and the true value of nuclear is kind of complex. The role, the value of it, it's complex, it's multifaceted, and it's often hard to understand by a number of stakeholders, as we've been talking about in the earlier session. And often the discussions and decisions revolve around everything from energy policy, what can I actually implement, what's important to me in hearts and minds, what my stakeholder perspective is, am I a member of the public, an investor, and so on and so forth. So we really wanted to enable that kind of broader audience to engage in this assessment, figure it out for themselves, not have the arguments rammed down people's throats, let people come to the table and a much larger set of stakeholders and have a larger audience thinking about it. But what we wanted them was to have some very resilient, solid set of technical data and assumptions, and yet make it palatable and usable by all. And also, we don't want to promote just nuclear. This is just to understand from a policy perspective, where does nuclear kind of fit in? So the solution we came up with is that we want to try and utilize GAIN to be the kind of custodian or the home of a series of data sets and tools to access those data sets. If you like, the authoritative, independent perspective, where people can come to, and GAIN, for those people who've been around GAIN for long enough, we've worked hard to ensure that we play the honest broker. You know, we say when nuclear is bad as when we say it when it's good. We try and help the utilities, the developers, the new tech companies, but also government and investors and the public. And we've had a number of opportunities where we've reached out to a range of people through workshops and seminars like this. So we therefore wanted to see if we could use GAIN, and this was primarily Christine's idea, and I've been working with Christine on this, to, you know, what kind of data do this broad set of stakeholders need? Economics, policy, siting studies, you know, these are the kind of questions that broad stakeholders really ask us about, and often these are themes that keep coming up. So we really want GAIN and the GAIN website and the GAIN community to be, GAIN initiative to be the community access for a lot of these things. So we want to be the custodian and the sharer of this information. And so in order to do that, we've developed a tool, and we'd really like to launch that today. And so to help with that kind of a little bit and put it way better than I just did, we have a very short little movie, and then I'll give you a quick demo of the tool. So Holly, if you're able to play the video, that'd be, just say, play the video, please.
U.S. energy policy is of critical importance to the nation, as it can create economic opportunity and help combat climate change. However, understanding the true impacts of changes to energy policy is hard. There are many complex interactions and variables that can have unintended consequences, and lots of misinformation that makes science-based approaches difficult. In addition, the true impact of many energy options are not fully understood or easy to visualize. What if there was an easy way to model changes in energy supply and demand to determine the overall impact on the U.S. or an individual state in an intuitive and easy-to-use manner? Now there is. Meet the Energy Calculator, provided by the Gateway for Accelerated Innovation in Nuclear. This application allows you to easily change inputs to energy supply and demand through intuitive sliders by providing instant visual feedback on the landscape with detailed charts and graphs that show the measurable impacts across a variety of factors. You don't need to worry about the complex mathematical modeling. The GAIN Energy Calculator handles all of this complexity while providing you an easy-to-use and intuitive application. Better yet, once you have built your model, the application allows you to export it and share it with others so the community can collaborate and discuss the best overall solutions. The GAIN Energy Calculator will allow state, local, and federal policymakers, students, researchers, and other interested stakeholders to visualize and model their policy changes and see real-world results based on validated science. Science-based energy policy, powered by the GAIN Energy Calculator. Learn more today at gain.inl.gov.
So apologies for the short hiccup at the beginning there, but hopefully you got the point across. So, Holly, if you can move to the slides, and what I planned to have done was done a live demo of the tool. Unfortunately, the GoToWebinar doesn't easily allow that to happen. So what we've taken is I've taken some screen grabs and just talk you through. So what we'll be doing is we will be launching this and making it available through the LinkedIn and through social media in the coming days. It will be accessible by anybody who wants to. There's no password. You go free. It's free to use. You can just go and play with it as much as you wish to and want to. So when you land on the landing page, you'll see this little thing, and there's an introductory video you can click on, or you can click on the start button, and then if you click on the next slide, please, Holly. So when you get to the next stage, what we try to do here is, and I touched on this earlier, is that sometimes people are interested in, well, what's the policy and the consequences of my policy at the national level, at the federal level? So you can play the game and look to implement various policies and look at how your policies manifest itself at the national level. But equally, you can select any individual state and look to use the policy at the state level. Now, the reason we've done this is that some people, like for example, students or members of the public, may want to play the nationwide game, but approach it at that level. Others, however, particularly like state legislators or maybe people who work for a utility or something more locally, they really want to look at the state level and how state policy is implementing, and again, how it's manifesting itself. Next slide, please. So what you do then in this particular case, I just clicked on the state. I'm in Tennessee. So if you click on Tennessee and then start, the first thing you get is you get a series of quick facts. So in those states that have actually beginning to roll out things like their renewable portfolio standards or clean energy standards or new policy and so forth, you will first of all get a series of bullet points that will highlight and illustrate for you what those new policies are. Again, so this is a bit of a wiki. All this data is taken from various places like the EIA or from various government sites. So it's all reputable, standardized data. But basically, the idea is then when you land on your page for your state, you can then see what policies are current and what are being implemented. And what we will be doing is rolling out. For those states that have a new policy in place or looking to implement a policy, there will be predetermined saved cases that you can then load up. So you can say, well, what's the current status quo if I do nothing? Or you can load in their future policy and see how their policy, how far will it go to kind of towards those goals. And then again, like you can, in the actual real thing, you can scroll down. There's a whole set of other quick facts about where energy comes from, what the mix of energy is, what the population is, and so on and so forth. Next slide, please. So again, unfortunately, this slide is a little bit busy, but it's not this complicated when you run the tool. So what you'll find on the tool is the thing on the right-hand side, that's kind of like dashboard, shows you a representation of the world that you are in. So namely, the house is the implication of your policy on your household and your immediate local environment. The kind of fields and the infrastructure around that, things like transportation and so forth, and the cityscapes and so on, are really kind of how the implementation of policy will affect you more locally, but kind of more outside the city, in the city, and maybe broader into the broader region. And then ultimately, the broader ones start looking at transportation, like aircraft, bigger transportation, or bigger energy, things like where you're going to build these things and so on. You can therefore like really see how this is like local, intermediate, or kind of further away. What you also then see at the very top is it will show you how you are doing to achieve your target. So you can set a CO2 reduction target, and you can see how you're going. In this particular case, the do nothing for Tennessee basically means that compared with now, there will be a 34% increase in greenhouse gas emissions by 2050 compared with when this was started, the data set started in 2017. So what you then find on the left-hand side is a series of demand sliders and a series of supply sliders. And depending on the levels of ambition that you want to set, you can slide those supply and demand sliders across. Now, again, I'm not going to have time to go through all of these, but you can begin to see some examples here. So if you want to set very demanding transportation ambitions, things like everybody moves to electrification of transport, both for domestic use, but also for for haulage and so on and so forth. You will then slide it all the way over, and you'll see on the actual app on the website when you use it, as you slide across, it will show you what levels of ambition you've set. But what that means, how for example, is it 100% electrification of transport or 50% and so on. So there are sliders associated with that. So typically from the demand side, there's 5 sliders for transport. There are 6 for households. There are 7 for businesses. And then ultimately, you can also then look at the supply side for electricity generation. So do you want to start looking at nuclear, renewables, reduction in gas, coal, and so on and so forth. Then there's also a supply from bioenergy and a couple of others. And again, so this is very much playing that kind of supply and demand. The cool thing is, as you move the sliders across, what you will see is there is actually a live feedback, not only on the results. So for example, you will see as you make each slide, you will see whether each of those individual movements reduces or increases your CO2 targets. But equally, we'll also see the results in that lower half there, where it shows you the overview for 2050. You will see where your energy is coming from and going to. But as importantly, you will see how your decisions manifest themselves in the real world. Namely, if I was to say, well, I want electrification of transport, you will see live the cartoon there, live changing with a bit of animation, and more cars will come in with electrification on them. The large kind of trucks will also be electrified. You'll also then see at your house the charge points appear. Next slide, please. And so this is the kind of examples just to show you what the changes were. If you look in the top one, this is just, again, looking at the starting position where I've done nothing. What I've then done in the lower one, just again, I've arbitrarily just chosen a couple of examples, but if I then move to my slider to be very aggressive in renewables and also reduce the amount of meat, basically, or cows that we consume, again, interesting effects, and anybody's ever played that game, I'd encourage you to look at just the demand on emission, the impact on emissions for cows and meat products. But you can see just how by changing renewables and fewer cows, you see obviously the change in the fields, but you also then begin to see how the electrification of transport has happened, how you've got a move to renewables with the solar panels and the wind turbines on the hills there. And then there's obviously, as a result of that, there's a resulting reduction in the use of coal and oil that you see kind of on the landscape in the distance there. So again, you can see, and this is very useful just for people to realize how, like I said, how your decisions and your policy manifest itself as you are more or less ambitious. Next slide, please. What you can then also do is, again, you'll see on the left-hand side here, the little grey box on that far left-hand side. You can click on each of those little icons, and as you move down, it shows your results at different levels of granularity in different areas. So just to show you an example here, you can then look at what the supply and demand of your electricity is. So in this particular case, you're looking at the overall demand curve, the overall supply curve in the top left, showing you what comes from conventional, from CCS, from nuclear, onshore, offshore wind, etc., based on the targets that you've set. Clearly, there's what appears to be kind of like an overshoot, that the demand, the total production is total supply is a little bit greater than demand. The reason being is the tool doesn't take into effect the losses in electricity distribution. And then similarly, on the flip side, you can look at the demand side to see where the demand for that electricity or that energy is going. In this particular case, it's heavily dominated by lighting and appliances, or heating and air conditioning, or industry, or so on and so forth. So again, you see the different classes. And again, live, if you were moving those sliders and you wanted to look at the impact on demand, you can see that happen too. Next slide, please. And then equally, I think it's always useful is to see the energy flow, or the so-called Sankey diagram, where you can see on the left-hand side where my energy forms came from, and then ultimately on the right-hand side where they're going to. And again, this is really very useful to again really understand what the supply and demand is, but what the flow and transfer is, and again how your policies can be changed, can really affect this kind of flow. Next slide, please. So the other thing as well, we wanted to make sure, obviously, we keep talking about emissions and CO2 and so on and so forth, and you can certainly see that. But there's also a broader environmental consideration here that we wanted to underline to people, not just the overall emissions environmental considerations, but also the land mass that is being used. I noted on 2 or 3 occasions there were references to land mass. You know, so many areas of the equivalent to India being consumed with biomass and so on and so forth. In this particular case, we used the more standard US unit of football fields. So obviously my accent suggests I mean soccer fields. No, I mean American football fields in this particular case. But it's interesting to know that energy density and so forth is really an important part of this, and is something that really can and should drive our considerations, particularly for those states that may be more land limited. And so again, this idea of understanding, it's all well and good that I want to move to, let's say, substantial renewables and hydroelectric or onshore and offshore wind or whatever it may be, but how does that impact our land use capability, I think is really important. And this tool enables you to also see that. Next slide, please. So that's a very, very quick run through. The tool, I believe, is very, very straightforward to use. We've been very, very lucky in this, that we actually have been able to secure the tools from the actual engine behind this has actually been provided to us by the UK government. For people who may have seen the 2050 energy calculator that the UK government produced a number of years ago, which is now called the Mackay Energy Calculator, in reference to Professor David Mackay, who died unfortunately a few years ago. So the UK government has been very kind to provide us with the access to the algorithms. We Americanized them, the tool and the assumptions, and built that in here. But we're keen to get your input and your use of this. The tool has been developed for much broader utilization. It's not for GAIN and the GAIN team or for DOE to be using. It's for anybody to use. So as I said, keep your eyes and ears open for the future releases through social media and through the LinkedIn group. That'll be coming in the next couple of days. What we're really keen for you to do is see what you can come up with, either for your state or for the nation, to tackle this carbon-free future that we've been talking about today, and really begin to hopefully tease out some of the things, the questions that have been raised and possibilities. If we go back to our early presenters from the state levels and so on, it'd be really interesting for the state to kind of play this game and see how their policies would be impacted. Unfortunately, the tool isn't looking at the economics right now. We do have that in reserve for the 2.0 version release in the coming weeks or months ahead. The other cool thing, though, is that you can actually save and share your findings. So not only so that you can come back to what you've done before and save you. So if you manage to come up with a perfect solution and you fixed your energy policy for your state or for the whole country, we would hate for you to lose all that insight and that brain power. But also, please share it. The beauty of the tool is you can share your results on social media. So again, please use the LinkedIn group and other social media to share them. By all means, feel free to promote the tool if you think other people, maybe you've got children at school or at university or any others, or indeed your politicians who you think may be interested in using and provide the insight from this. Please feel free to share your results and indeed the tool link to them. So as I said, this is the version 1.0. This is something we've been working on for the last few weeks, well, actually a short number of months now. And so we definitely intend to do more with it if you are interested and if the community at large is interested. So please provide us with any feedback that you have. We'd love to hear your thoughts as to good or bad. We'd also be really interested to see developing this in the future. For example, including things like changing this not only for the state level, but we've heard about the kind of regional electricity distribution areas. So these are the kind of things we're looking to do in the future. So there we are. That's the very quick canter through of the energy calculator. It should be intuitive to use. If it isn't, then we've missed our goal. I'm just quickly looking at a couple of questions that came in. Is this just for the USA? Yes, it is indeed just for the USA. There is a UK version of this, so at the moment this is very much about the potential for us to implement at the state or national level within the US. And the primary reason for that is there are an awful lot of assumptions and clever calculations that go into this behind the scene. For example, population growth, expectation of electricity growth, and so on and so forth, but also things like what's the energy efficiency of buildings and so on. So that's the kind of thing we use. Another question, do you think that don't you think not including transmission loss is a mistake? Renewables are not where power is needed. No, sorry, to be clear, we do include transmission losses. They are indeed included in the analyses. So sorry if I misrepresented that. They are indeed, and hence that's why there was a greater supply and demand. There was a difference there in that one particular curve. And the other ones, for example, if you look at raw energy or electricity conversion, again, the losses are taken into account because of thermal conversion, depending on what the use is. So we have all that built in. So that's all I had to say on the energy calculator. Laurie, did you want to come back in at that point in terms of closing out?
Yes. Good job, Andy, and all the panelists for the whole webinar. This has been very interesting. A lot of information going on here. And
yes, so I think we'll certainly be collating the questions.
Yep.
I'm sure if Christine was here right now, well, she's here in spirit. She's always here with us in spirit. She'd be telling us this is not the this is the beginning, not the end of this story. I think this.
Right.
This is just
we have the next webinar, Andy, is reimagining energy, and it'll probably be maybe about 6 weeks or so from now. And there's great plans for this webinar as well. So please keep an eye on the GAIN website, and we will also be sending out invitations to let you know. But social media and the website, you should hear about it. Look for it here in the next month and a half or so.
Excellent. Yeah, and I think the important thing for everybody to bear in mind that we're trying to deliberately involve a much broader set of people involved in not only giving the presentations, but also the audience attending. So, you know, let's not, as a nuclear community, only preach to the choir. We want everybody involved in terms of energy policy, investment, public, politicians, everybody. So we're trying to open this question up about broader energy and figuring out where nuclear can play and what our constraints are. So watch this space. So,
yep.
So
well, thank you.
Yes, over to you, Laurie. You go ahead.
No, I did. I said thank you.
Well, yeah, I'd like to say personal thank you to all the speakers. They made my job as a facilitator very easy. So that's always good. So thank you very much indeed. Thanks for all the contributions. Thanks for everybody who stuck with it. I think we had about a good turnout throughout, and I think we had about 100 or so at one point. So thanks for everybody for sticking through. Hopefully you've all got something from it, and we look forward to seeing you all at the next event. Thanks everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.